My daughter wanted to move into my house and claim my master bedroom. When I firmly refused, her husband hurled a heavy oak chair directly at my face. As blood poured down my cheek, my own daughter stepped over my body and screamed that I was selfish. I did not scream back. I simply drove myself to the emergency room, wiped the blood from my screen, and texted my lawyer that phase 1 was complete. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to people who mistook your silence for weakness. My name is Ellis. I am a 69-year-old retired structural engineer, and I have spent my entire life building foundations that do not crack under pressure. My family, however, was about to learn exactly what happens when you try to demolish a building that I designed. The eviction notice from my own child was delivered over a plate of roast beef. It was a Tuesday evening in my home, a home my late wife Cynthia and I bought 30 years ago, a home I paid for with decades of sweat, complex calculations, and long hours on construction sites. I was sitting at the head of my own dining table quietly cutting my meat when my son-in-law Brent cleared his throat. Brent was a failing real estate broker with a sense of entitlement that far exceeded his actual talent. He wore expensive suits he could not afford and drove luxury cars that belonged to the bank. He and my daughter Kendra had moved into my guest wing 6 months prior because Brent had miraculously misplaced all their savings in terrible investments. I gave them shelter out of love for my daughter, but gratitude was not a currency Brent ever traded in. He leaned across the table, tapping his expensive silver fork against his porcelain plate. He told me I had 48 hours to clear my belongings out of the master bedroom. He stated it not as a polite request, but as an absolute command. He claimed Kendra was pregnant, though I saw no physical evidence of this, and said they needed the massive space for a lavish nursery. He gestured vaguely to the rest of my house, calling my antique furniture and Cynthia's framed photographs old junk that was taking up entirely too much room. He said a man my age had no business hoarding a 4,000 square foot property all to himself. I placed my knife and fork down on the table. The room went completely silent. I looked him dead in the eye and asked him where exactly he expected me to sleep. Brent smirked a nasty little twist of his thin lips and suggested the unfinished basement. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and gave him my answer. I told him absolutely not. The word no hung in the air like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. For a man like Brent, a man drowning in secret debts and hollow pride, being denied anything in front of his wife was an unforgivable insult. His face flushed a violently angry red. He slammed his fist down on the mahogany table so hard the water glasses rattled and spilled over the edges. He started screaming, spewing vicious insults about my age, my stubbornness, and my supposed irrelevance. I simply stared at him. I did not blink. My absolute calmness only fueled his complete rage. He stepped back from the table, his breath coming in ragged, aggressive gasps. I saw his eyes lock onto the heavy oak dining chair next to him. It was a solid custom-built piece that Cynthia had commissioned from a local artisan 20 years ago. It weighed a solid 25 pounds. Brent grabbed the back of the chair, hoisted it into the air with a primal grunt, and hurled it directly across the room at me. There was no time to dodge. The thick wooden leg struck the right side of my face with a sickening crack. The impact knocked me backward out of my own seat. I hit the hardwood floor hard. Pain exploded behind my eye, a blinding flash of white light followed immediately by the warm, thick sensation of blood pouring down my cheek and soaking into my crisp white collar. The chair clattered to the floor beside me. I lay there for a moment, waiting for my vision to clear. I expected a gasp of horror. I expected my daughter to rush to my side to scream at her violent husband, to desperately call for an ambulance. Instead, a pair of expensive designer heels stepped right into my line of sight. Kendra stood over me. She did not reach out a hand. She did not ask if I was alive. She looked down at my bleeding face with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She pointed a manicured finger at me and screamed that I was completely selfish. She yelled that I was ruining her life, ruining her marriage, and that I deserved this for being such a stubborn old fool. She stepped right over my bleeding body, grabbed her designer purse, and stormed out the front door with Brent right behind her. The front door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the deafening silence of my own dining room. The metallic taste of blood was heavy on my tongue. The throbbing in my skull was severe, but I did not panic. I did not shout into the empty house. I did not shed a single tear of betrayal. A lesser man might have let his heart break right then and there. But I am an engineer. I deal in stress tests, load-bearing capacities, and controlled demolitions. My heart had already been broken months ago when I found the hidden bank statements proving they had been stealing from my private retirement accounts. Tonight was simply the physical stress test I had been waiting for. I sat up slowly, leaning against the baseboards. I pulled a spotless handkerchief from my pocket and pressed it firmly against the gash on my face to slow the bleeding. I reached into my slacks and pulled out my smartphone. My hand was perfectly steady. I opened the camera application. I took 3 clear, high-resolution photographs of my face, ensuring the deep laceration and the ruined blood-soaked shirt were well documented. I then stood up, ignoring the intense dizziness, and took 4 photographs of the shattered oak chair lying in the pool of my blood. The physical evidence was secured. I walked to the hall closet, grabbed my heavy coat, and walked out the door. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car. I did not call the police. That would be a massive rookie mistake. A domestic disturbance call right now would lead to a messy, chaotic argument with patrol officers who might just tell Brent to take a walk around the block and cool off. I needed something far more permanent. I needed federal documentation. I drove myself through the dark city streets directly to the nearest hospital emergency room. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency room waiting area buzzed overhead as the triage nurse rushed toward me with wide eyes. I played the part perfectly. I became the frail, battered senior citizen. They ushered me into a private examination room immediately. While the doctor prepared the stitches and the local anesthetic, he gently asked me what happened. I gave him a weak, shaky smile and lied. I told him I tripped over a rug and fell against the heavy furniture. The doctor frowned, looking closely at the clear, blunt force trauma on my face, and shook his head. He told me the angle of the injury did not match a simple fall. I looked away, pretending to be terrified and ashamed, remaining completely silent. That silence was all the medical professional needed. I knew the hospital protocols inside and out. Under state law, emergency room doctors are mandatory reporters. If they suspect a senior citizen is covering up domestic violence, they are legally obligated to flag the medical file and contact the authorities themselves. The trap was set. The federal machine was finally waking up. While the doctor stepped out of the room to gather his official reporting forms, I pulled out my phone one last time. I opened my messages and selected the contact for Jonathan, my ruthless and highly expensive corporate attorney. I typed out a single short sentence and pressed send. Phase 1 is complete. My family thought they were pushing a week-old man into the grave. They had absolutely no idea they had just handed me the shovel to bury them. The heavy wooden door of my examination room pushed open. 2 uniformed city police officers stepped inside, their leather duty belts creaking in the quiet, sterile space. The younger officer held a standard-issue notepad, while the older one rested his hand casually on his radio. The attending doctor had done exactly what I anticipated. By state law, medical professionals must summon law enforcement when a senior citizen presents with unexplained blunt force trauma to the head. The older officer introduced himself as Sergeant Miller. He took one long look at my bloodied shirt and the fresh row of black stitches running along my cheekbone. He asked me directly who had assaulted me in my home. Before I could even open my mouth to answer, the chaotic sound of high heels clicking frantically against the linoleum hallway echoed outside. Kendra burst into the examination room, completely ignoring the hospital staff trying to hold her back. She had completely transformed her appearance and demeanor during the short drive from my house. The cold, disgusted woman who had stepped over my bleeding body was gone. In her place was a frantic, weeping, devoted daughter. She rushed to the side of my hospital bed, dropping her designer handbag to the floor, and grabbed my hand with both of hers. Tears streamed down her carefully made-up face. She gasped loudly, acting utterly horrified by the sight of my stitches, as if she had not been standing right there when the heavy oak chair shattered against my skull. She looked at the 2 police officers with wide, innocent eyes and immediately began spinning a fabricated narrative. She told them she was so worried about her father. She claimed she had rushed straight over the moment she heard I had taken a terrible fall. Sergeant Miller frowned, looking back and forth between Kendra and the jagged wound on my face. He told her the doctor did not believe this injury came from a simple fall. Kendra did not miss a beat. She leaned closer to me, blocking the officer's view of my face, and lowered her voice to a desperate, urgent whisper. She begged me not to say a word about Brent. She squeezed my hand tightly, her nails digging into my skin. She hissed that if I pressed charges, Brent would lose his real estate license and go to jail. She weaponized her supposed pregnancy again, crying that the stress would cause her to lose the baby. She pleaded with me to protect their family completely, disregarding the fact that her husband had nearly killed me an hour ago. Then she reached into the pocket of her expensive trench coat and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the tray table next to my bed. It was a medical power of attorney, a sweeping, comprehensive legal document that would immediately grant her total control over my healthcare decisions, my bank accounts, and my physical assets in the event I was deemed incapacitated. She pulled a gold pen from her purse and pushed it into my hand. She switched her tone from desperate to sweetly commanding. She told me the hospital bills were going to be terribly complicated. She said I needed to rest and heal and that she would take care of all the financial burdens while I recovered. All I had to do was sign the paper to make things easier for everyone. It was a brilliant predatory move. In one stroke, she planned to sweep the assault under the rug and legally steal the house I had just refused to give her. I looked down at the document. I looked at the gold pen in my hand. Then I looked past Kendra, making direct eye contact with Sergeant Miller. I took a slow, deep breath, playing the part of the weary, confused old man perfectly. I told the officers that my daughter was right. I told them my eyesight was getting poor in my old age, and I had simply tripped over the edge of an antique rug in the dining room, striking my face hard against the wooden edge of the table on the way down. I called it a terribly clumsy accident and apologized for wasting their valuable time. Sergeant Miller did not look entirely convinced, but without a complaining witness, his hands were legally tied. He closed his notepad, gave me a long, knowing look, and stepped out of the room with his partner to clear the call. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind them, Kendra let out a massive sigh of relief. The fake tears dried up instantly. She tapped the power of attorney document with her polished fingernails, silently demanding I finish the transaction. I did not argue. I did not throw the paper in her face. I gripped the gold pen. I am naturally right-handed, a fact my daughter has known since the day she was born, but I deliberately moved the pen into my left hand. I let my fingers tremble violently. I pressed the ballpoint against the signature line and dragged it across the page, producing a jagged, illegible, chaotic scribble that barely resembled human letters, let alone my legal signature. I handed the pen back to her. Kendra snatched the paper up, her eyes scanning the messy ink. She did not care about the quality of the signature. She only cared that ink was on the page. She had absolutely no idea that a left-handed, intentionally botched signature executed under medical duress is instantly voided in any court of law. Even more importantly, she had no idea what was happening just on the other side of the examination room wall. While she was busy forcing a useless piece of paper on me, my attorney Jonathan was already executing his part of the strategy. Jonathan is not just a lawyer. He is a financial predator who destroys corporate monopolies for a living. I pay him a very large retainer to be ruthless. 10 minutes before Kendra even arrived at the hospital, Jonathan had successfully contacted the chief of medicine at this facility. He informed them that my estate was worth over $4 million and that my son-in-law had a documented history of severe gambling debts. He instructed the medical staff to ignore whatever story I might tell the police under duress. Following Jonathan's direct legal guidance, the attending emergency room doctor had already logged onto the state registry and officially flagged my medical file with a Priority 1 alert for severe elder abuse and financial exploitation. Kendra carefully folded the invalid document and tucked it safely into her expensive trench coat. Her posture straightened. The weeping, concerned daughter completely vanished, replaced by the arrogant, entitled woman I had seen in my dining room. She did not bother to ask if the stitches hurt. She did not offer to drive me home. She simply looked down at me with a cold, victorious smirk. She told me to get a taxi home and that she would be over in the morning to start packing my belongings into the basement. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed she had outsmarted a senile old man, covered up a violent felony, and legally secured a multi-million-dollar estate all in a single evening. She turned on her heel and strutted out of the hospital room, her designer shoes clicking loudly down the hallway like a victory march. I sat up in the hospital bed, listening to the sound fade away. I reached up and carefully touched the thick bandages on my cheek. It throbbed with a dull, heavy pain, but I felt absolutely no anger. I only felt the cold, calculated satisfaction of an engineer watching a condemned building taking its final breaths. Kendra thought she was holding the master key to my entire life in her pocket. She had no idea that the piece of paper she carried was entirely worthless. She had no idea that the federal trap had already been armed, locked, and fully engaged. When the sun came up tomorrow morning, she and her violent husband were going to wake up in a world where they owned absolutely nothing. The sun rose the next morning over the city, casting a warm, golden light across the manicured lawns of my upscale neighborhood. I did not wake up in my own home. I woke up in a pristine, high-security corner suite at a luxury downtown hotel, having packed a small overnight bag immediately after leaving the emergency room. I sat in a plush armchair by the floor-to-ceiling window sipping a freshly brewed cup of dark roast coffee. My face throbbed slightly under the fresh bandages, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I rested my tablet on the glass coffee table in front of me and opened the security application connected to my house. I had installed top-of-the-line military-grade exterior cameras 2 years ago. Now I had a front-row seat to the exact moment my daughter and her husband realized their entire world was collapsing. At exactly 8 in the morning, a massive commercial moving truck rumbled onto my driveway, crushing the edge of Cynthia's prize-winning rose bushes. Brent stepped out of the passenger side, wearing a crisp designer polo shirt and his signature arrogant smirk. Kendra slid out of the driver's seat, holding a large iced coffee, looking as though she had not a single care in the world. They casually walked up the flagstone path to my front door. Brent reached into his pocket and pulled out his brass house key. He shoved it into the deadbolt and tried to turn it. The key did not budge. He jiggled it aggressively, cursing under his breath, and tried again. It was completely useless. Before checking into the hotel last night, I had called my security provider and ordered a total system wipe. The physical deadbolts had been electronically disengaged and the smart locks had been reprogrammed with a new 24-character encrypted password. My house was a fortress, and they were officially locked out. Watching through the high-definition camera, I saw Brent's arrogant smirk instantly vanish. He stepped back from the door, his face twisting into that familiar, uncontrollable rage. He pointed at the digital keypad, barking orders at Kendra. She rushed forward and frantically punched in her old access code. The panel flashed a bright red light and emitted a harsh buzzing sound, denying her entry. She tried again, pressing the button so hard her knuckles turned white. Red light. Buzz. Denied. Brent threw his hands in the air, pacing back and forth on the porch like a caged animal. He clearly believed I was inside the house, ignoring them out of spite. He began pounding his fists against the heavy oak door, shouting my name, demanding that I open up immediately. He yelled that he had a moving truck paying by the hour, and that I was acting like a petulant child. When shouting produced no results, Brent's violent nature took over. He walked over to the large decorative stone planter resting near the entryway. He picked up a heavy, jagged landscaping rock. Kendra grabbed his arm, suddenly looking nervous, but he violently shook her off. With a massive swing, Brent hurled the heavy stone directly into the side glass panel of my front door. The reinforced glass shattered with a spectacular crash, sending crystalline shards raining down onto the hardwood floor inside. He reached his arm through the jagged hole, intending to manually flip the interior lock. The exact second his hand crossed the threshold, the perimeter alarms engaged. A deafening, piercing siren erupted from the exterior speakers, echoing loudly enough to wake up every single neighbor on the block. Red strobe lights began flashing from the eaves of the roof. Brent panicked, trying to pull his arm back out, but his sleeve caught on a piece of broken glass, tearing his expensive shirt. Within less than 3 minutes, the distant wail of police sirens joined the chaotic symphony. 2 local patrol vehicles came screeching into my driveway, tires smoking as they blocked the moving truck from leaving. 4 police officers leaped out of their vehicles with their hands resting cautiously on their holstered weapons. They shouted loud, clear commands for Brent and Kendra to step away from the shattered door and put their hands where they could be seen. Brent immediately went into his standard routine. He raised his hands, pasting on a fake cooperative smile, and began fast-talking the officers. He confidently explained that this was simply a massive misunderstanding. He claimed the house belonged to his father-in-law, that he was legally authorized to move in today, and that he had accidentally locked himself out. He gestured toward Kendra, proudly announcing that his wife held the legal medical power of attorney and was in full control of the estate. He ordered Kendra to show the officers the folded document she had forced me to sign in the hospital. Kendra practically lunged toward her designer purse, pulling out the piece of paper with my left-handed, completely illegible scribble on it. She shoved it toward the lead officer, acting as though it were a golden ticket that made them immune to the law. The lead officer, a stern-looking man with graying hair, did not even reach out to take the paper. He looked at it, briefly, shook his head, and asked them to produce their government-issued identification. Brent eagerly handed over his driver license, assuming the police were about to apologize for the inconvenience and leave. The officer inspected the ID, tapped his radio, and spoke a 10 code into the microphone attached to his shoulder. He waited for a response from dispatch. When the radio chirped back, the officer looked at Brent with an expression of pure professional coldness. The officer flatly stated that he was not going to arrest Brent for breaking and entering today. Brent let out a loud, obnoxious sigh of relief, turning to give Kendra a victorious look, but his celebration was entirely premature. The officer walked back to his patrol vehicle and retrieved a thick, heavily sealed manila envelope from the front seat. He walked back to the porch and pressed the envelope firmly against Brent's chest. The officer explained that they had been dispatched to this specific address not just because of the broken window alarm, but because the property was now under a strict protective hold by the state. He informed Brent that a Priority 1 investigation for severe elder abuse and major financial exploitation had been officially launched at midnight. Brent stared at the officer, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. The officer continued, his voice echoing loudly over my tablet speakers. He stated that under the federal provisions of the Elder Abuse Act, the government had preemptively and aggressively intervened to stop the suspected bleeding of my assets. As of 6 o'clock this morning, every single joint bank account, savings account, credit line, and investment portfolio tied to either Brent or Kendra's social security numbers had been completely frozen by federal banking authorities. The government had locked their assets to investigate the $75,000 they had illegally siphoned from my retirement fund. The officer instructed them to step off my property immediately or face charges for criminal trespassing on a protected crime scene. Kendra's face drained of all color. She looked like she was going to be physically sick. She ripped the manila envelope out of Brent's hands and tore it open. Her eyes darted frantically over the dense legal documents inside, reading the official freezing orders from the state attorney general. Brent stood completely paralyzed on the porch, the reality of the situation slowly crushing the air out of his lungs. While they stood there entirely incapacitated by the legal strike, the driver of the commercial moving truck hopped down from the cab. He was a large, heavily built man wearing a sweat-stained uniform, and he looked incredibly annoyed. He stomped up the driveway, completely ignoring the police officers, and marched straight up to Brent. The driver loudly declared that he charged $200 an hour with a 4-hour minimum, and he was not about to sit around while they sorted out their criminal issues. He aggressively demanded his payment for the truck rental and his wasted morning, stating he needed the money right now before he backed the rig out of the driveway. Brent visibly swallowed hard sweat suddenly pouring down his forehead. Trying desperately to maintain his facade of wealth and control in front of the police, he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his thick leather wallet. He smoothly extracted a shiny platinum credit card and handed it to the imposing driver. The driver pulled a mobile card reader from his tool belt, swiped the platinum card, and waited. The small machine beeped loudly, displaying a bright red error message. Declined. Brent's eyes widened. He quickly snatched the card back, muttering something about a fraud alert, and handed the driver his primary bank debit card. The driver swiped it. The machine beeped red again. Declined. Panic completely overtook Brent's face. His hands began to shake as he pulled out every single piece of plastic in his wallet, handing them to the driver one by one. Every single swipe resulted in the same harsh red light and the same mechanical beep. Standing on the edge of the lawn, Kendra frantically pulled out her smartphone. She opened her banking application, her fingers trembling wildly. Through the camera feed, I watched her staring down at the bright screen. I knew exactly what she was seeing. Where there used to be tens of thousands of dollars, there were now only zeros. Every account had a solid red padlock icon displayed next to it. They were standing in the middle of my driveway, surrounded by armed police officers, holding a worthless piece of paper with a furious contractor demanding cash they absolutely did not possess. They had no access to credit. They had no access to savings. In the span of a few short hours, my ungrateful daughter and her violent husband had been reduced to having exactly $0 to their names. I took another slow, satisfying sip of my coffee and watched the screen as the truck driver began shouting. Phase 2 was executing flawlessly. As the commercial moving truck angrily backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the street, Brent was left standing on the curb next to his ruined wife. But the frozen bank accounts represented a threat far greater than a canceled moving day. Brent was not just a failing real estate broker with bad spending habits. He was deeply entangled with a network of underground hard money lenders. These were not legitimate banks with customer service departments, grace periods, or polite collection agencies. These were ruthless, dangerous individuals who operated through anonymous shell companies providing massive high-interest cash loans to desperate brokers trying to flip commercial properties. Brent owed them $300,000, and his crushing monthly interest payment was due by noon today. He had fully intended to use the $75,000 he illegally siphoned from my retirement fund to keep these dangerous creditors at bay for a few more months. With the federal government now locking every single financial avenue he possessed, Brent was effectively a dead man walking. I watched through the security camera feed on my tablet as he pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking so violently he nearly dropped the expensive device on the concrete. He was checking his messages. I knew with absolute certainty that his lenders were already demanding their money. The color completely drained from his face as he read the bright screen. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. He could not stall them anymore. He had no house to leverage, no credit cards to drain, and absolutely no cash to withdraw. He was cornered, terrified, and entirely desperate. When a narcissistic man is pushed into a corner, his fear instantly morphs into violent rage. He cannot accept responsibility for his own failures, so he must find a target to destroy. Brent separated himself from Kendra, stomping across the front lawn and furiously dialing his phone. A moment later, my own cell phone began to vibrate on the glass table in front of me. The caller identification displayed his name in bright letters. I let it ring 3 full times before I calmly swiped the screen to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply listened. Brent did not hold back a single dark thought. He launched into a chaotic screaming tirade, his voice cracking with a toxic mixture of sheer panic and pure venom. He demanded that I call the federal authorities immediately and tell them the elder abuse claim was a massive misunderstanding. He ordered me to unfreeze the joint accounts, screaming that I was destroying his entire life, his career, and his marriage over a stupid, petty argument about a bedroom. When I remained completely silent, refusing to offer him the argument he desperately craved, his frustration escalated into severe criminal territory. He told me that if I did not fix his financial problems by the end of the day, he would hunt me down. He explicitly threatened to find me in whatever hotel I was hiding in and cave my skull in with a baseball bat. He promised that he would return to my property tonight, pour gasoline around the perimeter, and burn my precious house to the foundation while I watched it turn to ash. He hurled every vile, disgusting insult he could think of, trying to use brute intimidation to force my hand. He truly believed he was terrifying a frail, isolated old man who would eventually cave to his aggressive demands. Brent was severely mistaken about his audience. I was not cowering alone in my hotel room. I had left the hotel an hour ago. I was currently sitting in a plush leather armchair inside the corner office of my attorney, Jonathan. We were located on the 40th floor of a premier downtown high-rise overlooking the bustling financial district. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished mahogany desk between us. My phone was resting precisely in the center of that desk, set to speakerphone, broadcasting Brent's unhinged death threats at maximum volume for the entire room to hear. Placed right next to my phone was Jonathan's high-end digital recording device. A small red light pulsed steadily, capturing every single word with perfect crystal-clear audio quality. The digital clock on the device stamped the exact time, date, and location of the recording, ensuring the audio file would meet the strict evidentiary standards of any federal courtroom. Jonathan sat across from me, sipping a cup of dark roast coffee, a shark-like grin spreading across his face. As Brent continued to scream about arson and murder, Jonathan casually pointed a silver pen at me, signaling for me to keep the suspect talking. I leaned forward slightly toward the microphone. I kept my voice incredibly calm, sounding slightly confused and appropriately intimidated. I asked Brent to clarify what he meant. I asked him directly if he was threatening my physical safety and my property. That simple question was like throwing a bucket of gasoline on his raging fire. Brent took the bait instantly. He screamed his violent threats a second time, adding even more graphic details about what he would do to me if the bank accounts remained locked. He cemented his own felony charges perfectly, leaving absolutely no room for a defense attorney to claim he was misunderstood. I thanked him for his phone call and calmly ended the connection. The silent office felt incredibly peaceful after the abrupt end to Brent's screaming. Jonathan reached over and pressed the stop button on the recording device. He looked at me with deep professional satisfaction, stating that we now had undisputed evidence of felony terroristic threats and premeditated arson. He offered to send the audio file directly to the district attorney right now, assuring me that the police tactical units would have Brent in handcuffs before lunchtime. I shook my head and told Jonathan to wait. Sending Brent to a holding cell would be entirely too easy. A public defender would eventually get him out on bail, and he would spend months fighting the charges while sleeping on couches and pretending to be a victim of an unfair justice system. I did not want him fighting the legal system just yet. I wanted him to face the immediate, terrifying consequences of his financial betrayals. I asked Jonathan to transfer the digital audio file to a secure, encrypted flash drive. Once I had the file, I opened a heavily encrypted, untraceable email account I had set up weeks ago for this exact purpose. I drafted a message directed to the primary contact email of the underground lending syndicate holding Brent's massive debt. I attached the crystal-clear audio recording of Brent having a complete psychological breakdown and screaming about his frozen accounts. In the body of the email, I wrote a single brief paragraph. I informed the lenders that their borrower was entirely out of funds under a massive federal investigation and was actively packing his bags to flee the state by midnight tonight to avoid paying his debts. I hit send. I did not need to involve the police to punish Brent. I simply needed to point the sharks in the right direction and let nature take its course. Following the email sent to the loan sharks, I felt a deep sense of absolute calm. However, a cornered animal will always thrash wildly before it finally expires. While sitting in the quiet luxury of Jonathan's law office, my smartphone chimed with a high-priority emergency alert from my neighborhood property management portal. Brent, entirely stripped of his liquid cash, and his pride had decided to weaponize his last remaining asset: his intimate knowledge of local real estate regulations and municipal codes. Desperate to inflict any kind of pain on me after being locked out of the house, he had spent his morning furiously typing on his phone. He had filed multiple anonymous, highly severe structural complaints to the local homeowners association regarding my property. Because he was a licensed broker, Brent knew exactly which buzzwords would trigger an automatic aggressive response from the compliance board. He falsely claimed my roof was caving in, that I had executed unpermitted foundation work, that there were exposed electrical wires posing a fire hazard, and that the house was an immediate public safety risk to the surrounding neighbors. Brent knew how vicious and uncompromising our local homeowners association could be. His goal was simple and incredibly vindictive. He wanted the board to levy crippling daily fines against me, forcing a massive legal lien on my property. He hoped this financial pressure would legally compel me to sell the house to a cash buyer just to cover the penalties, thus leaving me homeless and vulnerable. It was a petty, spiteful maneuver from a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose, acting out of pure malice. I thanked Jonathan for his excellent legal counsel, buttoned my tailored coat, and took an executive car service directly back to my neighborhood. I wanted to meet this ridiculous threat in person. As my driver pulled up to my pristine curb, I saw a white sedan parked directly in my driveway, completely blocking the path to the garage. A large magnetic decal on the passenger door displayed the official gold seal of the Neighborhood Homeowners Association. A stout, aggressively dressed man in a tight polo shirt was marching across my front lawn. He was holding a heavy metal clipboard and aggressively snapping photographs of my rain gutters and the broken front window Brent had smashed earlier that morning. I stepped out of the car, adjusted my cuffs, and politely asked the man what exactly he was doing on my private property. The man sneered at me, introducing himself as Gregory, the senior compliance inspector for the residential district. He did not offer a handshake or a polite greeting. Instead, he marched right up to me and shoved a thick stack of printed complaints roughly into my chest. Gregory spoke to me with the slow, wildly condescending tone one might use with a confused, disobedient child. He informed me that my property was in severe violation of at least a dozen foundational community ordinances. He pointed his plastic pen at my brick facade, loudly declaring that he was initiating an immediate emergency condemnation protocol based on the anonymous reports. He threatened me with the preliminary penalty of $50,000 effective immediately. He further stated that a daily compounding fine of $1,000 would accrue until I completely rebuilt the entire front half of the residential structure to his exact specifications. He looked me up and down, mocking the fresh medical bandages on my face, and cruelly suggested that if an old man like me could not afford the fines or the upkeep, I should simply surrender the deed to a younger, more capable family member. The absolute arrogance radiating from his pores was palpable. He truly believed he possessed the ultimate authority to ruin my life right there on my own front lawn. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to defend the structural integrity of my home. I am a retired structural engineer, and the foundation of my house is solid enough to withstand a massive earthquake, but explaining that to a petty tyrant was a waste of breath. I simply nodded, walked past him, and used my newly programmed access code to unlock my front door. I gestured for Gregory to follow me inside. He stepped into my foyer with a triumphant, nasty smirk, clearly believing I was about to write him a massive check to make the problem disappear or beg for his mercy. I led him straight down the hallway and into my private study. I walked over to the heavy steel fireproof safe bolted to the floor in the corner of the room. I spun the mechanical combination dial, pulled the heavy steel door open, and extracted a very thick, incredibly dusty leather-bound binder. I walked back to my solid oak desk and dropped the heavy binder right in front of Gregory. The loud thud echoed heavily in the quiet room. I told him to open it and read the first page. He rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by what he perceived as a delay tactic, and flipped open the heavy leather cover. Inside were the original yellowed typewritten foundational documents for the entire residential district. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched his arrogant smirk slowly melt into a mask of pure confusion and then absolute, unadulterated terror. I calmly explained to Gregory that my late wife Cynthia was not just a resident of this community. 30 years ago, she was the primary commercial land developer who purchased this entire acreage. She personally drafted every single word of the Homeowners Association bylaws he was currently trying to weaponize against me. More importantly, I directed his attention to the legal clause at the very bottom of the fourth page, highlighted in faded yellow marker. When Cynthia passed away, her controlling interest did not dissolve into the community. It transferred directly and entirely to me. I informed him that I was the majority shareholder of the Master Land Trust. I owned the literal ground beneath the neighborhood streets, the community pool, and the building where his small office was located. I held absolute, unquestionable veto power over the entire Homeowners Association Board of Directors. I was not just a homeowner paying monthly dues. I was his ultimate superior, the invisible hand that allowed his entire organization to exist. Gregory visibly swallowed hard. The color completely drained from his face as the crushing reality washed over him. He realized he had just threatened to condemn the home of the man who legally owned the entire community structure. His confident posture completely collapsed. He began to stammer uncontrollably, taking rapid steps backward, trying to backtrack his aggressive behavior. He claimed he was simply following up on an anonymous tip and meant absolutely no disrespect to me or my late wife's incredible legacy. I cut him off immediately. I looked him dead in the eye and informed him that he was fired on the spot. I terminated his employment for gross incompetence, trespassing on private property, and engaging in targeted harassment based on entirely fraudulent, unverified reports. I demanded he leave his metal clipboard, his company identification badge, and the keys to the association vehicle on my desk and walk off my property immediately. He did not argue. He stripped off his badge with shaking hands, dropped his items on the oak wood, and practically sprinted out of my front door, terrified of further legal retaliation. But I was not finished. Gregory was merely a foolish pawn in a much larger game. I needed to send a devastating shockwave directly back to the man who actually sent him. I pulled a blank piece of official Master Trust letterhead from my top desk drawer. I took my fountain pen and wrote out a binding executive mandate from the Master Land Trust. I utilized my absolute authority to order an immediate, highly invasive structural audit of the luxury condominium complex located downtown. This was the exact complex where Brent and Kendra had recently signed an expensive lease, desperately trying to maintain their wealthy facade while waiting to steal my house. I cited severe commercial zoning concerns and mandated that the building management must temporarily evacuate all tenants within 48 hours so my private engineering firm could tear into the drywall and inspect the primary load-bearing pillars. I signed the document with my steady right hand, officially sealing their fate. Brent thought he could use local real estate laws to make me homeless and break my spirit. He was about to learn the hard way that I controlled the very ground he was trying to sleep on. He was about to be forcibly evicted from his luxury apartment, entirely disgraced in front of his wealthy neighbors with no bank accounts to rent a new place. The avalanche I started was picking up speed, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from Kendra. The tone of her text was entirely different from the arrogant entitlement she had displayed on my front porch just hours earlier. She wrote a long, seemingly heartfelt apology, claiming that the stress of their financial situation had driven Brent to act out of character. She begged me to meet them for a quiet, private reconciliation dinner at Le Petit Chateau, one of the most exclusive and expensive French restaurants in the city. She promised that Brent was ready to make a formal, sincere apology for everything that had happened. I knew immediately that this was a trap. Narcissists do not apologize unless they are preparing to ask for something massive. With their bank accounts frozen and their luxury condominium about to be torn apart by my structural engineers, they were absolutely desperate for cash. They needed my estate unblocked. I texted her back, agreeing to the dinner. I dressed in a dark, tailored suit and arrived at the restaurant exactly on time. The maitre d' led me to a secluded, dimly lit corner booth in the back of the dining room. Kendra and Brent were already seated, looking incredibly tense despite their expensive evening wear. Brent forced a tight, unnatural smile as I slid into the leather booth across from them. There was a fourth chair at our table, currently empty, which immediately confirmed my suspicions. This was not a family reconciliation. This was a calculated ambush. Before I could even open a menu, Brent aggressively signaled the waiter and ordered a bottle of their most expensive reserve whiskey. He poured me a massive, overflowing glass and pushed it forcefully across the linen tablecloth. He insisted we toast to new beginnings, practically ordering me to drink it down. I picked up the heavy crystal glass, brought it to my lips, and pretended to take a long, deep swallow, though I carefully kept my lips closed. As soon as the glass touched the table, a man in a cheap, ill-fitting suit slid into the empty fourth chair. Brent introduced him as a neutral third-party mediator. I recognized the brass stamp protruding from his breast pocket. He was a notary public, and based on his nervous sweating and Brent's desperate posture, he was heavily compensated to ignore basic legal ethics tonight. Brent reached under the table and pulled out a thick black leather folder. He flipped it open, revealing a highly dense legal contract. It was a complete surrender of my family trust. The document demanded I immediately transfer all my liquid assets, my property deeds, and my investment portfolios directly into Brent's control to bypass the frozen federal accounts. Brent leaned across the table, dropping the fake smile. His voice turned into a low, vicious hiss. He told me that if I did not sign the document right now, he would stand up and start screaming. He threatened to cause a massive, humiliating public scene, claiming he would tell the entire crowded restaurant that I was a senile, abusive father who was actively trying to murder his pregnant daughter. He knew I valued my quiet dignity above all else, and he thought the threat of a shameful public spectacle would terrify me into submission. Kendra sat silently next to him, her eyes completely devoid of guilt, watching to see if I would crack under the pressure. I let my hands begin to tremble. I slumped my shoulders forward, adopting the posture of a broken, exhausted, and deeply intimidated old man. I looked wildly around the crowded restaurant, pretending to be terrified of the wealthy patrons staring at us. I reached out with a shaky right hand and picked up the heavy gold pen Brent had aggressively placed on top of the document. I did not argue. I did not try to negotiate. I simply lowered my head, let out a pathetic sigh, and signed my legal binding signature on the bottom line. The very second the ink dried, Brent let out a sharp gasp of absolute triumph. He snatched the document out from under my pen with terrifying speed, as if he thought I might suddenly change my mind. He practically shoved the paper into the face of the corrupt notary. The sweaty man quickly pulled his heavy brass stamp from his pocket, pressed it firmly against the paper, and signed his own name, officially notarizing the transaction. Brent leaned back in his leather chair, a look of pure, unadulterated victory washing over his face. He actually laughed a cruel, mocking sound and told me I was a pathetic old fool for giving up so easily. He declared that he owned everything now, but his celebration lasted exactly 5 seconds. The curtain separating our private booth from the adjacent alcove was abruptly pulled back. Jonathan, my ruthless corporate attorney, stepped out from the shadows holding a half-empty glass of sparkling water. He was smiling like a shark that had just smelled blood in the water. Brent stopped laughing. He looked at Jonathan, then down at the black leather folder in his hands, completely confused. Jonathan calmly explained that high-end restaurants pride themselves on absolute discretion and exceptional customer service, especially for their most loyal, wealthy patrons. He gestured to the waiter who had poured the whiskey just moments ago. The waiter gave a polite, subtle bow. Jonathan revealed that the waiter had seamlessly swapped Brent's black leather folder with an identical one I had provided to the restaurant staff an hour before the dinner began. Brent frantically flipped the pages of the notarized document he was clutching in his hands. His eyes darted wildly across the dense legal paragraphs, desperately searching for the trust transfer language. It was not there. Jonathan stepped closer to the table, his voice cutting through the restaurant chatter like a scalpel. He informed Brent that he had not just secured my $4 million estate. Instead, Brent had just legally executed a voluntary assumption of debt contract. Furthermore, because Brent had brought his own corrupt notary to rapidly authenticate the signatures without reading the document, the contract was completely ironclad and immediately binding under state law. Jonathan explained the exact terms of the paper Brent was holding. It explicitly transferred the entirety of Brent's $300,000 underground real estate debt directly into Kendra's legal name as her sole individual financial responsibility. Kendra let out a blood-curdling shriek, dropping her wine glass onto the floor where it shattered into 100 pieces. She lunged at Brent, tearing at the lapels of his suit, screaming that he had just ruined her life. She was now legally on the hook for a massive, dangerous debt to violent loan sharks, and her husband had completely orchestrated it. I stood up from the table, smoothed the front of my tailored jacket, and tossed a $100 bill onto the table to cover my untouched drink. I looked down at the two of them tearing each other apart in the middle of the dining room. I did not need to raise my voice or make a public scene. I had just detonated a financial bomb in the center of their marriage. The morning after the spectacular disaster at the French restaurant, Brent was a man entirely devoid of options. He was legally strapped to a massive $300,000 debt with ruthless underground lenders. His bank accounts remained entirely frozen by the federal government, and his marriage had violently disintegrated. His only remaining lifeline, the sole thread keeping him from total ruin, was his real estate license. For the past 3 months, he had been aggressively marketing a massive $8 million architectural masterpiece situated in the wealthiest gated community in the entire state. The commission on that single sale was enormous. It was his absolute last ticket out of town. His desperate plan was straightforward. He would host a lavish, high-profile open house that afternoon, pressure an interested foreign cash buyer into signing a rapid no-contingencies contract, intercept the massive earnest money deposit directly into a hidden offshore account, and flee across the state line before the ink could even dry. I knew all of this because I still possessed full administrative access to the digital calendar he had foolishly synced to my home network months ago. I sat in my hotel suite drinking a quiet cup of tea and watched his schedule update in real time. The open house was scheduled to begin at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon. The property was a sprawling, ultra-modern glass mansion featuring infinity pools, imported Italian marble floors, and panoramic views of the city skyline. It was the absolute crown jewel of his brokerage firm. Brent arrived 2 hours early. He wore his finest tailored suit, attempting desperately to project an aura of immense success and unshakable confidence. But beneath the expensive Italian fabric, he was sweating profusely. His eyes darted nervously toward the heavy mahogany doors every few seconds. He was a desperate, cornered animal preparing for his final frantic sprint for survival. At exactly 1:15 in the afternoon, I stepped out of my hired executive car and walked slowly up the pristine, heated driveway of the glass mansion. I was dressed flawlessly in a sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit. My posture was perfectly straight, projecting an air of absolute authority despite the medical bandages still resting prominently on my right cheekbone. I walked through the massive double doors and stepped into the breathtaking grand foyer. The room was buzzing with wealthy potential buyers, sharp-dressed investors, and elegant catering staff carrying silver trays of expensive champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Brent was standing near the base of a sweeping glass staircase, aggressively pitching the property features to an older, wealthy couple. The exact moment he made eye contact with me, the false, charismatic smile instantly vanished from his face. His jaw clenched so hard I could visibly see the muscles twitching from 50 feet away. Panic completely washed over him. He hastily excused himself from his wealthy clients, leaving them mid-sentence, and practically sprinted across the polished marble floor to intercept me. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging desperately into my suit jacket, and dragged me forcefully behind a massive decorative stone pillar, completely out of sight of the invited guests. His breath smelled heavily of stale coffee and pure, unadulterated terror. He did not scream this time. He did not threaten to burn my house down. He begged. He leaned in incredibly close, his voice trembling uncontrollably, whispering a frantic, pathetic plea. He told me he was entirely ruined. He admitted that the loan sharks were going to physically destroy him if he did not pay them a massive installment by the end of the week. He pleaded with me to just turn around, walk out the front door, and let him secure this one massive commission. He promised that if I let him close this deal today, he would take his cut, leave Kendra alone, sign the divorce papers, and completely disappear from my life forever. He was shaking violently, literally sweating through his expensive silk shirt, terrified that I was going to shout and scare away his lucrative buyers. I looked down at his trembling hand still clutching my jacket sleeve. I brushed his fingers away slowly, treating him as if he were a minor, disgusting insect that had landed on my clothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not hurl insults at him. I simply looked him dead in the eye and told him I had absolutely no intention of making a public scene or speaking a single word to his buyers. I stepped smoothly around him, leaving him trembling and confused behind the stone pillar, and walked directly toward the custom-built state-of-the-art kitchen. I was not looking for a buyer. I was looking for his boss. Standing near the massive quartz island was Mr. Gallagher, the senior managing broker and the sole owner of the elite agency Brent worked for. Gallagher was a strict, highly respected, no-nonsense businessman whose entire empire was built on absolute legal compliance and an impeccable public reputation. I approached him, offered a polite, firm handshake, and introduced myself. I then reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit and withdrew a sealed, heavy-duty envelope. I handed it directly to Mr. Gallagher. I quietly explained that as an upstanding citizen, I felt a strong moral obligation to inform him about a severe, catastrophic liability currently operating under his corporate license. Gallagher frowned in confusion, opened the envelope, and pulled out the certified documents hidden inside. It was a complete, officially stamped copy of the police report from the emergency room permanently attached to the federal banking notice confirming an active Priority 1 investigation for severe financial exploitation of a senior citizen. Brent's name was printed in bold black ink as the primary criminal suspect. I maintained a perfectly calm, entirely conversational tone. I reminded Mr. Gallagher of the strict state real estate commission regulations. By state law, if a managing broker knowingly employs an agent who is currently under an active federal investigation for major financial fraud, the state can immediately revoke the entire brokerage license. I told Gallagher that harboring Brent in his agency for even one more hour was putting his entire multi-million-dollar business at massive legal risk. Mr. Gallagher read the federal document twice, his eyes widening with every single line. The color rapidly drained from his face as he realized the catastrophic legal danger standing right inside his own premier open house. He looked up from the paper and locked eyes with Brent, who was still hovering near the stone pillar watching our interaction in absolute horror. Gallagher did not hesitate for a single second. He did not ask Brent for an explanation or offer him a chance to defend himself. He snapped his fingers sharply and signaled for the two massive armed private security guards stationed at the front entrance. Gallagher marched directly up to Brent, his voice icy and completely devoid of any professional mercy. He informed Brent loudly that he was immediately terminated for gross moral turpitude, severe ethical violations, and creating an unacceptable legal liability for the firm. He demanded Brent surrender his corporate access keys, his agency tablet, and his company vehicle keys right there on the spot. Brent tried to argue desperately, reaching out his hands, completely humiliating himself in front of the wealthy investors who had stopped their conversations to watch the sudden commotion. He sobbed openly, begging Gallagher for just one more day to explain the situation. Gallagher simply turned his back in disgust and ordered the guards to remove the trespasser from the premises. The two large men grabbed Brent by the shoulders, completely ignoring his frantic struggling and pathetic whining. They physically dragged him across the polished marble floor, his expensive leather shoes scuffing the pristine stone, and threw him forcefully out the grand front doors. He landed incredibly hard on the concrete driveway, his tailored suit completely rumpled and his arrogant dignity entirely shattered. The heavy glass doors slammed shut behind him, locking automatically with a loud final click. Brent was now unemployed, legally hunted, and entirely alone on the curb. The demolition of his life was accelerating perfectly, and I had not even broken a sweat. The sun had set, casting long, sharp shadows across my hotel suite. The heavy, peaceful silence of the evening was abruptly broken by a frantic, rhythmic pounding on my door. I checked the security monitor mounted on the wall. It was Kendra. She did not look like the arrogant woman who had strutted out of my hospital room, nor the furious wife who had shattered a wine glass at the French restaurant. Her expensive makeup was smeared heavily under her eyes. Her hair was unkempt and tangled. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. She pushed past me without speaking a single word, pacing the floor of my suite like a trapped animal. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out a small white plastic stick, and slammed it down onto the center of my glass coffee table. It was a pregnancy test. 2 bright pink lines were clearly visible in the center window. She collapsed onto the sofa, burying her face in her hands, and began to sob loudly and uncontrollably. It was a highly theatrical performance, an emotional production designed specifically to break the heart of an aging father. She wailed about the severe physical stress I was putting on her body, claiming the terror of their impending financial ruin was directly threatening the life of my unborn grandchild. She had watched Brent lose his career and his final chance at a commission that afternoon. She knew they were entirely out of financial options, so she resorted to the oldest, most manipulative emotional weapon in existence, hoping to exploit my sense of family duty. Kendra wiped her eyes, smearing her mascara further across her cheeks, and looked up at me with a calculated, desperate intensity. The weeping daughter routine seamlessly transitioned into a vicious emotional hostage situation. She pointed a trembling finger at the plastic stick resting on the glass table. She declared that she was carrying the only grandchild I would ever have, the sole continuation of my family line. She demanded that I immediately pick up my phone and call Jonathan. She ordered me to drop the elder abuse investigation, unfreeze their bank accounts, and officially sign over the house deed by tomorrow morning. If I refused to comply with her demands, she promised to pack her bags, leave the state entirely, and legally change her name. She looked me dead in the eye and swore on her life that I would never see this child. She vowed that my grandchild would grow up believing I was a monster, or worse, believing I was entirely dead. She painted a vivid, cruel picture of me passing away alone in a sterile hospital room without a single family member to hold my hand, completely isolated from the legacy I had spent my entire life building. She leaned back against the sofa cushions, crossing her arms over her chest, wearing a look of absolute triumphant certainty. She genuinely believed she had just played an unbeatable hand. In her mind, no grandfather could possibly resist the primal urge to protect and connect with his own bloodline. She thought my love for an unborn child would completely override my demand for justice. She waited for me to break. She waited for the tears to form in my eyes. She fully expected me to reach for my phone and surrender my entire estate to save my future grandchild. I did not reach for my phone. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at the plastic stick on the table, and then I looked at my daughter. I felt a profound sense of pity, not for the fake tears she had shed, but for the sheer magnitude of her ignorance. She had absolutely no idea who she was dealing with. I walked calmly over to the mahogany desk in the corner of the room where I kept my leather briefcase. I snapped the brass locks open, reached inside, and pulled out a single sheet of paper inside a clear plastic sleeve. I walked back to the glass coffee table and slid the document directly next to the pregnancy test. I told her to read it carefully. Kendra frowned, thoroughly confused by my total lack of emotional surrender. She leaned forward and picked up the paper. It was a formal medical invoice, heavily itemized, from a premier urology clinic located just 2 towns over. The date printed at the top was exactly 2 years and 4 months ago. The patient name, listed in bold black ink, was Brent. The primary medical procedure billed on the invoice was a permanent elective vasectomy. I stood over her, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, and watched her eyes scan the medical codes. I explained that when Brent and Kendra had asked to move into my guest wing 6 months ago due to their financial struggles, I did not just blindly accept their excuses. I am an engineer. I verify everything before I allow a load-bearing weight into my structure. I hired a private investigator to run a comprehensive background check on my son-in-law to understand exactly where his money was disappearing. The investigator uncovered the massive underground debts, the shell companies, and this particular medical record. Brent had quietly sterilized himself over 2 years ago without ever telling his wife, ensuring he would never have the financial burden of a child dragging down his lavish lifestyle. Kendra stared at the paper. Her hands began to shake so violently the paper rattled loudly in the quiet room. Her face turned a sickly pale shade of white. The arrogant certainty was completely erased from her expression, replaced by a devastating mind-bending shock. She read the doctor's signature. She read the surgical notes. The reality of her husband's ultimate, deeply personal betrayal crashed into her all at once. I let the crushing silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment before I finally spoke. I kept my voice incredibly quiet, devoid of any anger or malice, which only made the words cut significantly deeper. I looked at the 2 pink lines on the plastic stick, then looked directly into my daughter's terrified eyes. I asked her a very simple, highly destructive question. I asked her if her husband had been medically sterile for over 2 years, whose baby was she actually carrying? Or I suggested casually, did she simply purchase a fake positive pregnancy test off the internet to try and extort her father for a few $1 million? Kendra could not speak. Her mouth opened and closed, but absolutely no sound came out. She was trapped in a flawless logical paradox. If the pregnancy was real, it meant she had been carrying on a secret affair and her marriage was built on a massive foundation of infidelity. If the pregnancy was fake, it meant she was a sociopathic liar who had just been caught trying to run a disgusting emotional con game on her own father. Either way, her leverage was entirely destroyed and her moral high ground was completely vaporized. I walked over to the door of my suite and pulled it wide open, gesturing for her to leave. I told her she had a very interesting conversation waiting for her when she returned to her ruined, unemployed husband tonight. The seed of total nuclear destruction had been planted perfectly in the center of their toxic marriage, and I was simply going to step back and let them tear each other to pieces. I did not need to be physically present in their luxury condominium to know exactly how the massive explosion occurred. Kendra returned home carrying the undeniable printed proof of Brent's secret vasectomy, completely obliterating whatever fragile facade remained of their shattered marriage. From what I gathered later through the bitter divorce filings and the police reports, the late-night confrontation was absolutely catastrophic. Brent flew into a violent, screaming rage when confronted with his own medical records, furious that his ultimate deception had been laid bare on the kitchen counter. Kendra, cornered by her own fake pregnancy scheme and humiliated by the truth, lashed out with equal venom. They physically tore their lavish apartment apart, hurling expensive decorations, smashing framed wedding photographs, and screaming vicious insults at each other until the frightened neighbors threatened to call the police. Their marriage was not just over. It was entirely incinerated, burned to the ground by their mutual greed and endless lies. But Brent was not thinking about marital counseling or hiring divorce lawyers. As he stared at his weeping, fraudulent wife, he was thinking about the $300,000 debt hanging over his head and the violent loan sharks who would be actively hunting him at dawn. He stormed out of the apartment into the freezing night air, absolutely desperate for a massive influx of untraceable cash. His frozen bank accounts were completely useless. His real estate career was officially dead and buried. He needed a high-value physical asset he could liquidate immediately on the black market to buy his way out of the city. His greedy, desperate mind immediately went to the crown jewel of my property, my fully restored classic 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1, sitting quietly under a heavy canvas tarp in my detached garage. He knew several illegal chop shops near the state line that would pay $50,000 in straight cash for the pristine vintage parts alone. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, my perimeter security cameras detected rapid movement near the dark side alley of my house. Brent had parked his car 3 blocks away and approached the property on foot, wearing a dark hooded sweatshirt pulled low over his face. He knew the electronic smart locks on the main house had been wiped, but the detached garage relied on a much older analog security system. He used a heavy steel pry bar to force the side window of the garage, shattering the old glass and slipping quietly into the dark structure. He walked past my tool benches and pulled the heavy canvas tarp off the Mustang. The polished silver paint gleamed beautifully under the pale moonlight filtering through the broken window. To Brent, this classic piece of American muscle was not a beloved restoration project or a piece of automotive history. It was his absolute salvation. He climbed into the pristine leather driver's seat, his heart pounding against his ribs. Because he had lived in my guest wing for 6 months, he knew exactly how the old ignition column was wired. He reached under the dashboard, forcefully pulled the plastic ignition panel loose, and expertly stripped the primary wires. Within seconds, he struck the exposed copper together. The massive V8 engine roared to life, shaking the wooden walls of the small garage. He hit the manual garage door release, slammed the heavy transmission into reverse, and backed violently out into the quiet suburban street. He did not turn on the headlights until he was 3 blocks away, desperate to avoid attention. Once he hit the main commercial avenue, he pressed the heavy gas pedal to the floorboard. The classic car violently accelerated, throwing him back into the leather seat. He merged onto the desolate, brightly lit interstate highway, a manic, breathless smile spreading across his sweating face. He gripped the wooden steering wheel tightly, genuinely believing he had finally outsmarted me. He thought he had successfully stolen my most prized possession and secured the emergency cash he needed to flee the state. He was speeding toward the city limits, completely unaware that he was driving a meticulously engineered coffin. I was still awake in my hotel suite, sitting comfortably in the leather armchair by the window overlooking the city skyline. I had not slept a single wink. I was waiting patiently for the final piece of the evening to fall perfectly into place. At exactly 2:15 in the morning, my iPad screen illuminated brightly in the dark room. A silent, high-priority push notification appeared on the screen bearing the gold logo of a highly advanced automotive security firm. The alert read, "Unauthorized ignition detected." I picked up the tablet and opened the proprietary tracking application. A highly detailed satellite map of the city materialized on the screen, displaying a bright, pulsing red dot moving rapidly down Interstate 95. I am a structural engineer, and I approach every single aspect of my life with extreme precision and foresight. When I spent 3 years restoring that classic Mustang, I did not leave the internal mechanics in the 1960s. I modernized the entire nervous system of the vehicle from the ground up. 3 months ago, when I first noticed the missing funds from my retirement accounts and realized my son-in-law was a severe financial liability, I took the car into a highly specialized security shop. I paid them $10,000 to install a military-grade GPS tracking module, an electronic fuel pump override, and a customized magnetic deadbolt system integrated directly into the heavy steel doors of the vehicle. Every single one of these defensive countermeasures was controlled exclusively through the encrypted application on my tablet. I sat back and watched the red dot on the map accelerate past 80 miles per hour. I did not act immediately. I waited patiently, tracking his exact location in real time. I wanted him completely isolated, far away from any residential neighborhoods or dark side streets. I wanted him out on the open, highly exposed stretches of the interstate where there were no exits, no alleys to hide in, and absolutely nowhere to run. When the GPS indicated he was crossing the massive suspension bridge spanning the city river, perfectly trapped between high concrete barriers, I raised my finger. I tapped the large red digital button on my screen labeled Engage Kill Switch. Out on the freezing interstate, Brent was rapidly shifting gears, the engine screaming loudly as he pushed the heavy car toward 90 miles per hour. Without a single warning light or mechanical stutter, the massive engine violently choked. The customized electronic fuel pump instantly severed the gasoline supply line to the engine block. The roaring V8 died immediately, plunging the fast-moving vehicle into a terrifying, unnatural silence. The vintage dashboard lights completely blacked out. The power steering locked up instantly, turning the steering wheel into dead weight and forcing Brent to desperately muscle the heavy car across the asphalt to avoid crashing into the concrete median. Panicking wildly, he slammed his foot on the brake pedal, coasting the dead-heavy vehicle to a grinding halt right in the center lane of the massive bridge. He frantically twisted the stripped copper wires under the dashboard, trying desperately to spark the engine back to life. Absolutely nothing happened. He cursed loudly, slamming his fists against the steering wheel, realizing the car was completely bricked. Deciding to abandon the vehicle and run on foot to the end of the bridge, he grabbed the chrome door handle and pulled hard. It did not budge. The custom magnetic deadbolts had engaged the exact second the engine died, fusing the heavy steel doors to the reinforced frame of the car. He slammed his shoulder against the glass, kicking the door panel and screaming in pure terror, physically trapped inside a reinforced steel cage of my own design. Suddenly, the dark interior of the Mustang was flooded with incredibly bright, flashing red and blue lights. A state highway patrol cruiser, automatically dispatched to the exact GPS coordinates by my security application the moment the kill switch was engaged, pulled up directly behind the stolen vehicle. Brent stared into the rearview mirror, his face completely drained of color. He was entirely locked inside a stolen vehicle, surrounded by armed police officers with absolutely nowhere to run. The spectacular failure on the interstate bridge should have kept Brent securely locked inside a county jail cell for months. He was caught red-handed inside a stolen classic vehicle with a severed ignition column. However, the municipal criminal justice system is notoriously overburdened and highly flawed. After spending 48 miserable, terrifying hours in a crowded holding tank, a heavily overworked public defender managed to secure his temporary release. The judge granted a low cash bond due to jail overcrowding, which Brent paid by forcing Kendra to pawn her last remaining piece of designer jewelry. But walking out of the county jail was not a victory for Brent. It was a death sentence. He was completely stripped of his professional real estate license, his bank accounts were frozen solid by federal investigators, and the loan sharks holding his $300,000 debt were undoubtedly tracking his every move. His luxury condominium was already locked down and being torn apart by my structural engineering firm. He and Kendra were entirely homeless, wandering the city streets with targets on their backs. Fueled by sheer desperation and the vicious, cornered mentality of a narcissist, Brent decided to launch a direct legal attack against me. He marched straight from the jail to the county courthouse and filed an emergency ex parte restraining order. He stood before a duty judge and spun a wildly fabricated, highly theatrical narrative. He claimed I was an unstable, violent old man harboring a massive cache of illegal, unregistered firearms inside my house. He twisted the narrative of his own assault, claiming my facial injuries were self-inflicted to frame him, and swore under oath that I had threatened to murder him and his pregnant wife. Because family courts mandate extreme caution regarding domestic violence threats, the judge did not wait to hear my side of the story. The judge immediately granted a temporary order of protection, effectively banning me from my own property. A uniformed sheriff deputy arrived at the lobby of my luxury hotel later that same afternoon to serve the official paperwork. The legal mandate was absolute. I was temporarily barred from coming within 500 feet of my primary residence until a formal evidentiary hearing could be convened the following month. Any violation of this perimeter would result in my immediate arrest. Within exactly 2 hours of the judge signing the order, my perimeter security cameras detected Brent and Kendra arriving at my property. They did not arrive in a luxury SUV or a commercial moving truck. They arrived in a cheap taxi carrying a few black plastic garbage bags filled with whatever crumpled clothing they had managed to salvage from their condemned apartment. Through the high-definition camera feed streaming directly to my tablet, I watched them break the police tape on the front door and strut into my foyer. They were absolutely exhausted, entirely broke, and legally hunted by dangerous men, yet they walked through my house with a sickening, triumphant arrogance. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me again. They thought they had successfully weaponized the justice system to steal my castle and banish the king to the wilderness. Kendra marched directly into my master bedroom, throwing her cheap plastic bags onto my expensive mattress, loudly declaring to the empty room that the house was finally theirs. Brent slumped onto my leather sofa in the living room, opening a bottle of my expensive wine. He gloated, loudly bragging to Kendra about how easily he had manipulated the legal system to secure a safe fortress against his creditors. They truly believed they could simply hide behind my locked doors and ride out the storm. They had absolutely no idea that I had willingly handed them the keys to a highly engineered Trojan horse. When the sheriff deputy handed me the restraining order in the hotel lobby, I did not argue. I did not call Jonathan to file an emergency appeal with the court. I simply smiled, thanked the officer for his time, tipped the hotel concierge, and happily extended my stay in the luxury corner suite for another 2 weeks. I wanted them inside that house. I needed them securely locked inside those walls for the next phase of my demolition to execute flawlessly. Months ago, before this entire conflict even erupted, I had noticed a very slight, persistent dampness in the deep crawl space beneath the guest wing of the house. As a seasoned structural engineer, I know perfectly well that minor moisture problems can rapidly evolve into catastrophic biological hazards if left entirely untreated. I had immediately contracted a highly specialized environmental testing firm to conduct a deep microscopic analysis of the primary HVAC system and the concrete foundation. The laboratory results had returned a highly toxic profile. I had tightly sealed the affected ventilation ducts and scheduled a comprehensive professional biohazard remediation to take place exactly during this specific week. When Brent smashed the side window and broke into the house yesterday morning, he severely disrupted the delicate negative air pressure I had established to keep the dormant spores contained. I sat back in my plush hotel armchair, opened my smart home application, and poured myself a glass of sparkling water. While I could not physically enter the property, I still retained absolute digital control over the central climate systems remotely from my tablet. I waited patiently until exactly midnight. I watched the thermal imaging cameras confirm that Brent and Kendra were deeply asleep in my master bedroom. Then I bypassed all the standard safety limiters and cranked the central heating system to its absolute maximum capacity. I opened every single dormant vent in the basement and the guest wing simultaneously. I forced the massive industrial fans to push the stagnant, heated air violently up through the floorboards and directly into the primary living spaces. The heavy blast of extreme heat acted like a massive biological incubator inside the sealed house. The dormant mold colonies hidden deep within the walls, the insulation, and the ductwork instantly exploded to life. The rapid temperature shift forced the spores to multiply exponentially, releasing a horrific, highly concentrated, toxic odor that smelled exactly like rotting wood mixed with raw sulfur. The air inside the house quickly became thick, heavy, and entirely unbreathable. At 2 o'clock in the morning, The night vision camera in the master bedroom captured Kendra violently jolting awake. She clutched her throat with both hands, gasping frantically for air in the suffocating putrid heat. She kicked Brent hard in the ribs, screaming in a panicked frenzy that the house was on fire or leaking natural gas. Brent stumbled out of the expensive bed, coughing uncontrollably as the toxic air severely burned the lining of his lungs. He reached blindly for the heavy brass lamp on the nightstand to turn on the light. As the bright halogen bulb illuminated the bedroom, the true horror of their situation became instantly visible. The pristine custom-painted white drywall of my master bedroom was no longer white. The extreme sudden humidity and the forced circulation had pushed the biological hazard completely through the porous material. The walls were literally sweating a thick, dark, fuzzy substance that seemed to be spreading across the ceiling by the minute. Long, terrifying streaks of black mold dripped down the corners of the room like dark veins. Brent and Kendra backed away slowly, covering their mouths with their shirts, their eyes wide with absolute horror. They had not locked themselves inside a safe, impenetrable fortress. They had completely barricaded themselves inside a highly active, federally classified biohazard zone, and their nightmare was only just beginning. Brent and Kendra were still frozen in the center of the master bedroom, coughing violently as the thick, sulfurous air burned their throats, when the heavy oak front door of my house suddenly splintered. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, a massive steel breaching axe tore through the reinforced wood of the main entryway. The terrifying sound of shattering timber echoed up the grand staircase. Brent grabbed a heavy brass candlestick, completely terrified that his ruthless underground lenders had finally come to execute him in the middle of the night. He pushed Kendra behind him, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the makeshift weapon. Heavy rhythmic footsteps stomped across the marble foyer downstairs. But the men swarming into my home were not violent gang members or loan sharks. A team of 6 massive men wearing fully sealed, bright yellow hazardous material suits with heavy oxygen tanks strapped to their backs marched aggressively into the hallway. Their faces were completely obscured by thick tinted respirators. The lead technician carried a heavy-duty thermal imaging scanner and a high-powered halogen floodlight. He swept the blinding beam of light up the staircase, catching Brent and Kendra in the harsh glare. Through his voice amplification system, the lead technician commanded them to drop any weapons, immediately cover their mouths, and evacuate the structure. He declared that they were actively breathing in lethal Class 3 biological toxins and that the building was undergoing an emergency federal breach protocol. I watched the entire chaotic scene unfold on my tablet from the comfort of my hotel suite. I had not called the authorities tonight. I had legally scheduled this exact tactical remediation operation 3 weeks ago, long before Brent had even thrown that wooden chair at my face. When my initial environmental testing confirmed the presence of the highly aggressive mold strain in the deep crawl space, the state health department had issued an automatic abatement mandate. I had intentionally delayed the physical execution of that mandate, timing the environmental strike perfectly to align with my eviction. The hazmat crew was simply executing a pre-authorized, legally binding contract to secure a severe biological threat. The lead technician marched up the stairs, completely ignoring Brent's frantic demands for an explanation. He slapped a thick red adhesive sticker directly onto the master bedroom door frame. The bold black letters on the sticker read, "Condemned for severe biohazard." He informed Brent and Kendra that the sudden extreme spike in the internal temperature of the house had triggered an exponential spore bloom, turning the entire residential structure into a highly active, federally classified toxic zone. Brent tried to argue, pointing to the temporary restraining order he had secured earlier that day, screaming that he had a legal right to occupy the property. The technician did not care about family court squabbles or restraining orders. He bluntly stated that state health and safety regulations completely supersede local municipal court orders. No judge in the country could legally force an environmental agency to allow human beings to sleep inside a condemned toxic structure. The technician ordered his crew to begin the immediate deployment of chemical neutralizers. He then grabbed Brent by the arm of his expensive pajamas and physically shoved him toward the staircase, ordering him and Kendra out of the house before their lungs suffered permanent, irreversible neurological damage from the toxic spore inhalation. Kendra stumbled down the stairs, coughing heavily into her hands, her eyes watering from the aggressive chemical fumes the remediation team was already spraying into the ductwork. She reached out and desperately grabbed the sleeve of the lead technician, pleading with him to let her run back upstairs. She cried that she needed to grab her designer purses, her expensive silk dresses, and the heavily packed garbage bags she had brought from her apartment. Brent was right beside her, loudly demanding that the crew allow him to retrieve his collection of luxury watches and his tailored Italian suits from the bedroom closet. The technician stopped in his tracks and looked at them as if they were entirely insane. His voice echoed mechanically through the respirator mask, delivering a devastating dose of environmental reality. He explained that under strict state protocol for Class 3 biological hazards, every single porous material located inside the active contamination zone was instantly classified as unrecoverable medical waste. This included all clothing, all fabrics, all leather goods, and any exposed paper documents. He informed them that the toxic mold spores had already deeply permeated the microscopic fibers of their expensive wardrobes. If they took those items outside, they would spread the biological hazard to the surrounding public environment. Therefore, the remediation team was legally mandated to seal every piece of clothing, every designer bag, and every single pair of shoes inside thick yellow biohazard bags. Those bags would be transported directly to a state facility and incinerated at 2,000 degrees by noon tomorrow. Kendra let out a blood-curdling scream. She watched in absolute horror as two hazmat technicians marched out of the master bedroom carrying massive yellow industrial bags filled to the brim with her entire surviving wardrobe. Everything she owned was being hauled away like radioactive trash. Brent tried to lunge at the technician, screaming that his luxury watches were metal and glass, not porous materials. The lead technician easily shoved him back, stating that the watches were sitting on a contaminated leather tray and were now officially sealed within the quarantine perimeter. Nothing was leaving the house except the two of them. The technicians forcefully corralled them through the front door, pushing them out into the freezing night air, and violently slammed the shattered heavy oak door shut behind them. The loud click of a heavy industrial padlock echoed across the porch. Brent and Kendra stumbled backward onto the cold concrete of my driveway. The bright strobe lights of the remediation trucks illuminated their terrified, exhausted faces. They were standing outside in the freezing 3 o'clock morning air, wearing absolutely nothing but their thin silk sleepwear. They had no heavy coats, no shoes, and no access to their vehicle keys, which were securely locked inside the toxic zone. Kendra collapsed onto the wet grass of the front lawn, wrapping her arms tightly around her shivering body, weeping hysterically as she watched her entire material life being bagged for the incinerator. Brent stood frozen on the curb, his bare feet numb against the freezing pavement. He patted the pockets of his pajama pants, a hollow, devastating realization washing over him. He had no wallet, he had no smartphone, he had absolutely no way to contact a taxi, call a friend, or beg for help. Even if he could reach a phone, his bank accounts were still completely frozen by federal investigators. His credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. They had been forcefully evicted from their luxury apartment, legally locked out of my estate, and physically stripped of every single item they owned. As I watched them shiver under the cold streetlights through my security feed, I closed my tablet and finally went to sleep. They were entirely homeless, completely broke, and utterly alone in the dark. The avalanche had finally reached the bottom of the mountain, burying them under the crushing weight of their own infinite greed. The sun began to rise over the freezing city streets, casting long, harsh shadows across the pavement where my daughter and her husband huddled. They had spent the last 4 hours sitting on a cold concrete bus bench, shivering in their thin silk pajamas, entirely stripped of their dignity and their possessions. Kendra was curled into a tight ball, weeping softly, completely broken by the reality of her new life. But Brent was not crying. His narcissistic brain was desperately scrambling for a way out. He had no wallet and no smartphone, but he was a man who lived his entire life built on deception and hidden contingencies. Years ago, before his real estate career completely collapsed, he had set up a secret, undeclared individual retirement account hidden deep within an offshore shell company. He had actively hidden this massive sum of money from his creditors, from the federal government, and even from his own wife. He kept a backup, unregistered black debit card tied directly to this offshore account, taped to the bottom of a metal locker at his exclusive downtown health club. He stood up from the freezing bus bench, completely ignoring Kendra's pathetic pleas for him to stay. He did not offer her a word of comfort. He simply turned his back on his ruined wife and began walking barefoot across the freezing asphalt toward the commercial district. His plan was incredibly simple. He would break into his gym locker, retrieve the black debit card, drain the daily maximum of $10,000 from an international ATM, and disappear across the border before the sun fully illuminated the sky. Brent walked for 3 agonizing miles, his bare feet bleeding and blistered from the sharp gravel and broken glass littering the city sidewalks. He snuck through the back service entrance of his high-end health club just as the morning cleaning crew arrived, slipping unnoticed into the luxury locker room. He dropped to his knees, reached under his designated locker and peeled away a thick strip of black duct tape. The sleek, heavy metal debit card dropped right into his trembling hand. A wave of profound, euphoric relief washed over his exhausted body. He clutched the card to his chest, genuinely believing he had just secured his ultimate salvation. He quickly grabbed a discarded pair of gym sneakers and an oversized hooded sweatshirt left behind on a bench, disguising his ridiculous pajama pants, and hurried out the front doors. He practically ran 2 blocks down the street to the massive glass vestibule of a premier international bank branch. The automated teller machines were already active. He stepped up to the glowing screen, his hands shaking with pure adrenaline, and pushed the heavy black card into the card reader. He rapidly typed in his secret 6-digit identification PIN and pressed the button to withdraw the maximum allowed cash limit. He waited for the familiar mechanical whir of dispensing bills. Instead, the screen flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson red. A harsh mechanical beep echoed through the quiet vestibule. The screen displayed a single, terrifying error code indicating the card was permanently retained. The machine completely swallowed the metal card. Brent panicked, pounding his fists against the reinforced glass screen, screaming at the machine to return his property. When the bank doors finally unlocked at 8 o'clock, he stormed inside, marching straight up to the senior teller desk. He aggressively demanded his card back, claiming the machine had malfunctioned. The teller typed his name into the secure banking terminal. Her polite customer service smile instantly vanished. She looked at Brent with an expression of profound alarm. She quickly stepped away from the counter and returned a moment later with the senior branch manager. The manager did not offer an apology. He looked Brent dead in the eye and coldly informed him that the offshore account did not exist anymore. Every single penny, every hidden asset had been aggressively seized at 4 o'clock this morning by the Internal Revenue Service under a massive federal tax evasion warrant. Brent staggered backward from the teller counter as if he had just been physically struck in the chest. His mind violently rejected the information. It was absolutely impossible for the federal government to know about that specific offshore account. He had layered it under 3 different anonymous corporate entities based in foreign jurisdictions. It was entirely invisible to standard domestic audits. He stood in the center of the bank lobby, gasping for air, unable to comprehend how the most closely guarded secret of his entire life had been completely exposed. But as I sat in my comfortable hotel suite drinking my morning coffee, I knew exactly how the financial guillotine had fallen. I am an engineer. I do not rely on luck. I rely on structural weak points. When I hired the private investigator to look into Brent's finances months ago, the investigator did not just find the vasectomy records. He uncovered the entire paper trail leading directly to the offshore shell company. I knew about the hidden money long before Brent ever threw that heavy oak chair at my face. I had explicitly instructed my attorney Jonathan to use that information to build the ultimate legal trap. When Brent sat in the French restaurant and aggressively rushed to sign the voluntary assumption of debt contract to steal my estate, he committed a fatal error. He was so blinded by his own greed and so eager to use his corrupt notary that he never bothered to actually read the dense legal paragraphs hidden on the 3rd page of the document. Jonathan had masterfully buried a highly specific, legally binding federal tax compliance clause directly into the center of the contract. By signing his name and having it officially notarized, Brent did not just assume the $300,000 debt for his wife. He signed a sworn, legally binding federal affidavit explicitly acknowledging the existence of the offshore shell company. He legally admitted on paper that he had been actively hiding over $500,000 in untaxed income from the federal government for the past 5 years. As soon as Jonathan walked out of that restaurant, he forwarded the fully executed notarized contract directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. The federal agents did not even need to build a case against him. Brent had literally handed them a signed, legally authenticated confession of massive felony tax fraud. The automatic audit triggered an immediate catastrophic seizure of all global assets tied to his name. The branch manager stepped out from behind the bulletproof glass of the teller counter holding a telephone to his ear. He calmly instructed Brent to remain exactly where he was, stating that the bank's security protocols required them to notify federal authorities whenever a flagged individual attempted to access a seized account. The sheer magnitude of his situation finally crushed whatever remaining defiance Brent possessed. He realized he was no longer playing a game of local real estate scams or petty family theft. Evading violent underground loan sharks was certainly dangerous, and it could cost a man his physical health. But evading the Internal Revenue Service was an entirely different level of destruction. The federal government does not negotiate, and they do not forgive. Committing massive documented tax fraud meant absolute undeniable ruin and a guaranteed decade inside a federal penitentiary. Pure animal panic seized his entire body. He turned away from the manager and sprinted toward the heavy glass exit doors, determined to run until his stolen shoes completely disintegrated. He burst through the doors and hit the morning pavement, ready to vanish into the crowded city streets. But his desperate sprint lasted for exactly 3 seconds. He froze entirely in his tracks, the morning air catching painfully in his throat. Directly across the sidewalk, blocking his only path of escape, 2 massive, heavily armored black sport utility vehicles were already idling silently at the curb. The tinted windows were pitch black, and the heavy steel doors were just beginning to swing open. While Brent was being forcefully shoved into the back of a federal sport utility vehicle by armed tactical agents, Kendra was still sitting exactly where he had abandoned her. She was stranded on a freezing concrete bus bench in the middle of the city, wearing nothing but her dirty silk pajamas. She waited for over 3 hours, shivering uncontrollably, before the devastating reality finally settled into her mind. Brent was never coming back. He had taken his secret debit card and left her to freeze on the street. Her luxury apartment was condemned. Her wardrobe was currently being incinerated by the state health department, and her bank accounts were locked in a federal vault. She had absolutely no one left to manipulate except the man she had tried to destroy. I was reading the morning financial newspaper in my hotel suite when a timid, rhythmic knock sounded at my door. I checked the security monitor. It was my daughter. She had walked over 4 miles through the city, barefoot and exhausted. I unlatched the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open. Kendra did not strut into the room with her usual arrogant entitlement. She practically collapsed across the threshold. She crawled onto the plush, pristine carpet of my luxury suite and dropped heavily to her knees. Her expensive silk pajamas were stained with black street grease and damp with morning dew. Her bare feet were blistered and bleeding onto the floor. Her face was a chaotic mess of smeared makeup dirt and dried tears. She looked up at me from the floor, clasping her hands together in a desperate, pathetic gesture of total submission. She had reached the absolute bottom of her existence, and she was preparing to play her final, most desperate card. She took a deep, ragged breath and launched into the most spectacular theatrical performance of her entire life. She completely threw her husband under the bus without a single second of hesitation. She looked up at me with wide, tear-filled eyes and claimed that she was a terrified, abused victim of Brent's violent, narcissistic control. She swore that she had absolutely no idea about his massive underground debts or his hidden offshore accounts. She wept loudly, claiming Brent had forced her to hand me that fake medical power of attorney in the hospital. She blamed the fake pregnancy test entirely on him, stating he had threatened to physically harm her if she did not try to extort the trust fund from me. She painted herself as a helpless hostage trapped in a terrifying marriage, paralyzed by fear, forced to watch her deranged husband attack her beloved father. Then she offered me a highly calculated business transaction disguised as a desperate plea for salvation. She promised to be the primary cooperating witness for the federal government. She offered to sit down with the district attorney and testify to every single one of Brent's real estate frauds, his tax evasion schemes, and his violent outbursts. She guaranteed she could send him to a federal penitentiary for 20 years. But her cooperation came with a massive price tag. In exchange for putting Brent behind bars, she demanded that I use my family trust to immediately pay off the colossal tax lien the Internal Revenue Service had just dropped on their joint accounts. She begged me to clear her name, secure her a new luxury apartment, and reinstate her monthly allowance so she could recover from her terrible trauma. She knelt on my carpet, sobbing into her dirty hands, entirely confident that her performance as a battered, repentant daughter would finally break my resolve. She thought my paternal instinct would blind me to her absolute sociopathy. I let her cry. I stood over her, my hands clasped casually behind my back, and allowed her to finish every single word of her fabricated victim narrative. I did not offer her a glass of water. I did not offer her a towel to clean her bleeding feet. When her sobbing finally subsided into dramatic sniffles, I turned around and walked over to my mahogany desk. I picked up my silver laptop, brought it over to the glass coffee table, and turned the screen to face her. I looked down at her and spoke in a voice entirely devoid of emotion. I told her that when I built the security architecture for my vintage Mustang, I did not just install a remote engine kill switch and magnetic door locks. I installed a comprehensive military-grade surveillance suite. I explained that the system included a high-definition wide-angle dashcam hidden in the rearview mirror paired with a highly sensitive, omnidirectional cabin microphone that constantly synced encrypted audio directly to my private cloud server. Kendra stopped crying. She stared at the silver laptop, a deep primal confusion slowly washing over her dirty face. I continued my explanation with surgical precision. I told her that 2 days before the infamous eviction dinner, I had walked out to my detached garage and noticed the heavy canvas tarp covering the Mustang was slightly misaligned. I knew someone had been sitting inside my classic car, so I opened my cloud server and reviewed the cabin audio logs. I knew they had been using the thick wooden walls of my detached garage and the comfortable leather seats of my car as their own private sanctuary to smoke cigarettes and plot their financial takeover, genuinely believing they were entirely hidden from my sight. I reached down and pressed the spacebar on my laptop. The crystal-clear, digitally enhanced audio file filled the quiet hotel suite. There was the sound of a heavy lighter striking, followed by the deep exhale of cigarette smoke. Then Kendra's voice echoed through the room. It was not the weeping, terrified voice of an abused wife. It was cold, calculating, and dripping with absolute venom. Her recorded voice clearly stated that I was becoming a massive problem and that I was never going to surrender the master bedroom voluntarily. Brent's voice mumbled something in the background about legal eviction notices taking too long. Then Kendra delivered the fatal strike. Her voice rang out from the laptop speakers with chilling clarity. She told Brent to just throw the chair at the old man. She told him to hit me hard enough to cause real damage, but not hard enough to kill me. She instructed him to scare me into signing the house over, declaring that I was a weak, pathetic old fool who would instantly fold under the threat of extreme physical violence. She literally handed him the blueprint for my assault. I pressed the spacebar again, stopping the recording. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Kendra was completely paralyzed on the floor. Her jaw dropped open, but her vocal cords refused to function. Her eyes were completely vacant, staring at the black screen of the laptop as if it were an executioner's blade. The flawless victim narrative she had just spent 20 minutes constructing was entirely vaporized in less than 15 seconds. She could not blame Brent for the violence. She could not claim she was a terrified hostage. The digital timestamp on the audio file proved beyond any reasonable doubt that she was the primary architect of the physical assault that put me in the emergency room. She was the mastermind who ordered the hit on her own father just to steal a master bedroom. I closed the laptop with a sharp, decisive snap. I looked down at the woman kneeling on my floor and realized I felt absolutely nothing for her. The paternal bond had been completely severed the moment she stepped over my bleeding body in the dining room. I told her that I was formally submitting this unedited audio file to the district attorney this afternoon. I informed her that the recording was undeniable evidence of a premeditated criminal conspiracy to commit severe elder abuse and aggravated assault. I told her the federal government did not need her testimony to lock Brent away because they already had his signed tax evasion confession. Furthermore, I stated that my legal team was actively filing a civil suit to ensure she remained fully responsible for half of the massive debt to the Internal Revenue Service. Kendra finally found her voice. It was a pathetic, broken whisper. She begged me to delete the file. She reached out with her dirty hands, trying to grab the edge of my trousers, pleading with me to remember that she was my only child. I stepped backward, completely avoiding her grasp. I looked at her with the cold, unyielding precision of an engineer inspecting a failed structure. I told her she was no longer my daughter. I told her she was simply a severe structural liability that I was permanently removing from my life. I walked over to the door of my suite and pulled it wide open. I ordered her to stand up, walk out of my room, and never attempt to contact me again. I promised her that if she ever stepped foot within 500 feet of me or my property, I would have her immediately arrested for violating the very restraining order her husband had so foolishly secured. She slowly pushed herself up from the floor entirely, broken, completely silent, and walked barefoot out into the hotel hallway. I closed the heavy wooden door behind her, locking the deadbolt with a loud, final click. I had officially cut her off forever, and the peace that settled over my mind was absolutely absolute. After his terrifying encounter with the Internal Revenue Service, Brent found himself completely out of options and wandering the desolate streets of the financial district. The federal agents had interrogated him for hours inside a sterile room, confiscating his passport and explicitly forbidding him from leaving the city limits while they prepared a massive federal indictment. Because he posed absolutely no flight risk without his hidden funds or travel documents, they released him onto the pavement with nothing but a court summons burning a hole in his pocket. He was a dead man shuffling through a damp, narrow alleyway behind a row of commercial dumpsters to avoid being seen in his filthy, oversized gym clothes. He thought he had hit absolute rock bottom, but the true nightmare was only just beginning. A sleek, black luxury sedan rolled silently into the alley, blocking his only exit. The heavy doors opened and two massive men stepped out. They were not wearing leather jackets or carrying baseball bats. They were dressed in immaculate, custom-tailored suits. These were the white-collar enforcers for the underground real estate syndicate holding his $300,000 debt. They operated with the cold, brutal efficiency of corporate executives dealing in broken kneecaps and shattered lives instead of stocks and bonds. They walked slowly toward Brent, the sharp click of their polished shoes echoing against the brick walls. Brent scrambled backward, his blistered feet slipping on the wet pavement until his spine hit the cold, unforgiving brick of a dead end. They cornered him effortlessly. The taller of the two enforcers stepped forward, invading Brent's personal space. He did not yell. He spoke in a low, perfectly modulated voice that carried the terrifying weight of absolute authority. He informed Brent that his grace period had officially expired at noon, and their employers were heavily displeased by his failure to communicate. He calmly explained that physical extraction of the debt was now mandatory. Brent began to hyperventilate, sliding down the brick wall until he was practically kneeling in the filthy alley. He begged for his life, his voice cracking with sheer animal panic. He swore he had the money yesterday, but the federal government had unjustly frozen his accounts. The enforcers stared at him with blank, unfeeling eyes. They did not care about the IRS or federal indictments. They only cared about the balance sheet. Seeing that his own excuses were completely useless, Brent resorted to his default survival mechanism. He deflected the danger onto his own family. He looked up at the suited men and frantically offered them a highly lucrative alternative. He told them about me. He spilled my full name, my exact location, and the room number of my luxury hotel suite. He spun a desperate, fabricated story claiming I was an incredibly wealthy, cowardly old man sitting on a multi-million-dollar trust fund. He told the enforcers that his pregnant wife was my only daughter and that I would eagerly empty my bank accounts to save her life and protect my unborn grandchild. He urged them to go to the hotel and intimidate me, promising them I would write a certified cashier's check for the entire $300,000 the moment they applied a little physical pressure. The enforcers exchanged a brief, calculating look. Extracting cash from a terrified, wealthy senior citizen was infinitely more profitable than beating a bankrupt real estate broker to death in an alley. The taller man grabbed Brent by the collar of his borrowed sweatshirt, warning him that if he was lying about the rich old man, they would return to cut him into very small, untraceable pieces. They dropped him back into the garbage and returned to their sedan, leaving Brent sobbing in the dirt, genuinely believing he had just successfully sacrificed me to save his own skin. Exactly 30 minutes later, a sharp, authoritative knock sounded at the door of my hotel suite. I had just finished my afternoon tea when I checked the digital security monitor. I saw two large, heavily muscled men in expensive suits standing in the hallway. I immediately recognized their posture and their cold demeanor. These were the debt collectors. I reached into my desk drawer, withdrew a thick legal file Jonathan had prepared for me earlier that morning, and placed it neatly on the glass coffee table. I walked to the door and pulled it open, greeting them with a polite professional nod. I invited them inside, completely unfazed by their intimidating physical presence. They stepped into the luxurious room, looking slightly confused by my utter lack of fear. The taller man cleared his throat and began his rehearsed intimidation script. He mentioned Brent's massive debt, dropping thinly veiled threats about the physical safety of my daughter if the financial obligations were not immediately satisfied. I did not flinch. I walked over to the minibar, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and offered them a seat on the leather sofa. I calmly informed them that intimidation was entirely unnecessary. I told them I knew exactly who they were, who they represented, and exactly how much Brent owed their syndicate. I sat across from them and opened the legal file. I slid a certified copy of the federal freezing order and the IRS seizure warrant across the glass table. I watched their eyes scan the government documents. I explained the harsh financial reality of their situation. Brent was officially indicted by the federal government. Every single asset he possessed was seized. He was facing a decade in federal prison. I pointed out that their $300,000 promissory note was currently completely worthless. It was toxic paper tied to a man who would never earn another legitimate dollar in his life. The enforcers frowned, realizing I was absolutely correct. The debt was entirely uncollectible. Then I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and offered them a highly strategic business proposition. I told them I had absolutely no intention of paying Brent's debt. However, as an investor, I was very interested in purchasing the debt entirely. I pulled a sleek black leather checkbook from the inside pocket of my tailored suit. I looked the two enforcers dead in the eyes and made my final offer. I proposed to buy Brent's entire $300,000 debt portfolio for exactly 10 cents on the dollar. I offered them a certified cashier's check drawn from a highly secure, entirely untraceable offshore trust account for $30,000 of clean, immediately accessible cash. I explained the logic behind my offer. They could either waste their time and resources torturing a bankrupt federally indicted criminal who had absolutely zero assets, or they could walk out of my hotel suite right now with a solid $30,000 to hand their bosses, completely washing their hands of the massive liability Brent had become. The men did not need to deliberate for long. They were pragmatic businessmen operating in a ruthless industry. Cutting their losses on a dead beat and walking away with a guaranteed sum of clean cash was the smartest operational move they could make. The taller man reached into his breast pocket and produced the original signed promissory notes bearing Brent's signature. He placed them on the table. I wrote out the cashier's check with my fountain pen and slid it across the glass. They inspected the secure watermark, nodded in deep satisfaction, and handed me the legal contracts. The transaction was completely seamless. They stood up from the sofa, adjusted their expensive suits, and extended their hands. I shook their hands firmly, exchanging a look of mutual professional respect. They turned and walked out of my suite, leaving me completely alone with the paperwork. I sat back in my armchair and picked up the heavy parchment contracts. Brent thought he had sent the wolves to my door to destroy me. He had absolutely no idea that I had simply fed the wolves and bought their leashes. The violent syndicate did not own Brent anymore. I did. I was now his sole, undisputed legal creditor, and I was about to collect. The sheer panic of standing outside the bank expecting to be thrown into the back of a federal tactical vehicle had nearly stopped Brent's heart. But the black sport utility vehicles had not moved. The agents inside were simply observing him, allowing him to marinate in his own destruction before they officially processed his indictment. Or so he thought. When they drove away without arresting him, Brent seized what he believed was a miraculous window of opportunity. He knew the Internal Revenue Service moved methodically, building airtight cases before making physical arrests. He calculated he had perhaps 24 hours before they issued a federal warrant for his physical detention. He needed to vanish immediately. He sprinted through the financial district, completely ignoring the agonizing pain in his blistered feet, and headed straight for the grimiest, most chaotic transportation hub in the city, the Central Greyhound bus terminal. He had managed to scrounge exactly $84 in crumpled cash that he found stuffed in the lining of his borrowed gym sweatshirt. It was just enough to buy a one-way ticket to a desolate rural town across the country where nobody cared about real estate licenses or federal tax liens. He planned to change his name Work Cash Jobs under the table and completely disappear from the grid. He stood in the long, poorly lit line at the ticket counter, nervously glancing over his shoulder every few seconds. The terminal smelled of stale coffee and desperation, a fitting environment for a man whose life had been completely reduced to ashes. He finally reached the thick plexiglass window of the ticket counter. He slapped his crumpled bills onto the metal tray, demanding a ticket on the next bus heading west. He did not care about the destination as long as it was 1,000 miles away from me, the federal government, and his violent creditors. Before the tired ticket agent could even print his boarding pass, two massive hands clamped down onto Brent's shoulders like steel vices. He gasped, his entire body going rigid. He recognized the heavy, expensive cologne immediately. It was the same two white-collar enforcers who had cornered him in the alley just an hour ago. He had explicitly sent them to my hotel room to extort me, fully expecting them to either get their money or beat me to death. Instead, they were standing right behind him in the bus terminal, looking entirely unbothered. The taller enforcer leaned down, his voice barely a whisper, and instructed Brent to walk quietly toward the exit unless he wanted his arms broken in front of the terminal security guards. Brent did not resist. All the fight had completely drained out of him. The two massive men practically carried him backward away from the ticket counter, leaving his crumpled $84 resting on the metal tray. They hauled him through the crowded waiting area, pushed open the heavy glass exit doors, and dragged him violently into the dark, secluded loading alley behind the station. They threw him hard against the brick wall. Brent slid down to the filthy concrete, throwing his hands over his face, sobbing uncontrollably. He begged them to just kill him and get it over with. He cried that I had obviously refused to pay his debt, that he was completely ruined, and that his life was over. The enforcers did not pull out weapons. They did not punch him. The taller man simply reached into his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a cheap plastic burner phone, and tossed it onto the concrete directly between Brent's bleeding feet. The screen was illuminated. The phone was already connected to an active call. The enforcer pointed a thick finger at the device and ordered Brent to pick it up. He stated that their new employer wished to speak with him. The two men then stepped back, crossed their arms, and blocked the only exit out of the alley. Brent stared at the cheap plastic phone as if it were a live explosive. He reached out with trembling hands, picked up the device, and slowly pressed the speaker against his ear. He expected to hear the gravelly, terrifying voice of an underground crime boss demanding his blood. Instead, he heard the calm, measured sound of ice clinking in a crystal glass. Then my voice came through the speaker. I greeted him by his first name, maintaining the same polite, professional tone I used when discussing structural blueprints. I heard his breath hitch in his throat. He stammered, completely incapable of forming a coherent sentence, his mind completely failing to process how I was on the other end of a loan shark's burner phone. I did not give him time to ask questions. I delivered the absolute crushing reality of his situation with surgical precision. I informed him that the two gentlemen standing in front of him no longer worked for the underground real estate syndicate. I explained that I had just purchased his entire $300,000 debt portfolio in cash. I told him I held the original signed promissory notes. I was now his sole, undisputed legal creditor. Brent let out a pathetic whimpering sound, but I cut him off immediately. I explained that because he had also signed that notarized voluntary assumption of debt contract at the French restaurant, the debt was fully authenticated and legally binding in civil court. I informed him that my attorney Jonathan had already filed the emergency paperwork with the state, utilizing the active federal fraud investigation as extreme leverage. Under the specific punitive statutes for severe financial exploitation, I had officially and legally garnished 100% of his future wages. Every single dollar he earned from now until the end of his miserable life belonged entirely to me. I owned his labor. I owned his time. I owned his absolute survival. I continued speaking, ensuring every single word carved a permanent scar into his psyche. I told him he had exactly two choices moving forward. Choice one was to run. If he attempted to board that Greyhound bus and flee the state, I would immediately hand the dash cam audio of his violent assault and the physical promissory notes directly to the federal agents who were already building his tax evasion case. If he ran, he would be a federal fugitive hunted down by the United States Marshals, and he would spend the next 2 decades in a maximum security prison. Choice 2 was to stay. If he stayed, he would accept whatever menial, humiliating employment I personally secured for him. He would clock in every single morning, perform hard, grueling labor, and his entire paycheck would be legally routed directly into my family trust to slowly pay off the $300,000 he owed me. He would live off the absolute bare minimum required by state poverty laws, which I would graciously provide in the form of grocery store gift cards and a cot in a boarding house. Brent dropped the burner phone onto the concrete. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He could not run and he could not hide. Death by loan sharks would have been quick. Federal prison would provide him with 3 meals a day and a bed. But I had engineered a completely different punishment. I had legally chained him to my wheel. He was no longer a wealthy broker nor a manipulative husband. He was my legal slave, entirely trapped in a prison without walls, forced to spend the rest of his life working off a debt he could never possibly repay. The new reality of Brent's existence set in the exact moment I terminated the call on his cheap burner phone. To satisfy the crushing wage garnishment I had legally enforced upon him, he needed immediate documented employment. However, finding a legitimate job for a man currently under a massive federal tax evasion indictment, entirely stripped of his professional real estate licenses and flagged by every major banking institution in the country, is virtually impossible. Corporate human resources departments ran his social security number and immediately discarded his applications. Fast food restaurants declined to hire a man shadowed by federal tactical units. He was entirely unemployable. But I am a man of deep resources and long-standing community connections. I did not want Brent languishing in a holding cell, unable to pay his massive debt. I wanted him working. I made a single telephone call to the general manager of the Oak Ridge Country Club. This was the exact same highly exclusive, staggeringly expensive private golf club where Brent used to purchase day passes to falsely parade himself in front of wealthy investors as a multimillionaire. I politely explained to the general manager that my former son-in-law was undergoing a severe personal rehabilitation program and required immediate humbling manual labor. The manager, a man who deeply respected my late wife's philanthropic contributions to the city, happily agreed to bypass the standard background checks as a personal favor to me. He offered Brent the absolute lowest rung on the entire corporate ladder, the groundskeeping sanitation division. The very next morning, Brent arrived at the pristine gated entrance of the country club. He was not driving a leased luxury sports car or wearing a tailored Italian suit. He had walked 2 miles from the cheap roach-infested boarding house I had secured for him. The ground supervisor handed him his new uniform. It consisted of heavy stained steel-toed boots, thick canvas work pants, and a violently bright neon orange safety vest. They handed him a metal trash grabber tool and a heavy-duty plastic garbage bag. His daily assignment was to patrol the edges of the immaculate 18-hole golf course, the driving range, and the outdoor dining patios, physically removing discarded cigarette butts, empty beer cans, and muddy food wrappers left behind by the wealthy members he once desperately tried to impress. For a raging narcissist whose entire identity was built on the projection of supreme wealth and social superiority, this was a psychological torture far worse than any physical beating. He was forced to walk the pristine greens with his head down, sweating under the harsh afternoon sun, terrified of making eye contact with the affluent golfers driving past him in their expensive carts. He spent his first 4 hours picking up wet napkins and dog waste, his blistered feet screaming in agony. But his ultimate humiliation did not come from the wealthy club members. It came from a completely unexpected source. Kendra had spent the night sleeping in the lobby of a cheap motel after I banished her from my hotel suite, desperate to find any familiar face or sympathetic former friend who might loan her a few $100s. She had wandered toward the affluent neighborhoods. She was pacing the manicured sidewalk just outside the wrought iron fences of the country club when she looked through the metal bars and saw a man in a neon orange vest picking up trash near the 7th hole. Kendra gripped the iron bars of the fence, her eyes widening in absolute horrified recognition. She watched Brent stab a discarded soda cup with his metal grabber and drop it into his plastic bag. All the remaining love, loyalty, and partnership in their marriage had already been incinerated by the fake pregnancy and the vasectomy reveal. But seeing her husband reduced to a literal garbage collector in front of the city elite ignited a completely new, vicious level of rage inside her. She did not feel pity for his terrible fall from grace. She only felt the burning sting of her own associated humiliation. She found a side maintenance gate left slightly ajar and stormed directly onto the pristine golf course. She marched right up to Brent, completely ignoring the wealthy foursome preparing to tee off just 50 yards away. She did not whisper. She unleashed a torrential, ear-piercing wave of verbal abuse. She screamed at the top of her lungs, mocking his neon vest, calling him a pathetic loser, a massive failure, and a disgusting embarrassment. She yelled that he had ruined her life and reduced them to street trash. The wealthy golfers stopped their game, staring in shocked silence at the hysterical woman in dirty silk pajamas screaming at the groundskeeper. Brent stood completely paralyzed, his face burning with a fiery, unendurable shame. He looked at the affluent members watching him, then looked at the furious, unhinged woman destroying whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left. But Brent was a survivor of his own making. He knew exactly what was at stake. If he engaged in a screaming match with his wife and caused a massive public scene, the general manager would fire him immediately. If he lost this minimum wage job, he would default on his wage garnishment. If he defaulted, I would instantly execute the trapdoor, handing the dashcam audio and the promissory notes to the federal authorities. Losing this pathetic job meant boarding a one-way bus to a maximum security federal penitentiary. Brent looked at the woman he had married. He made a completely cold, incredibly selfish calculation. He reached to his belt, unclipped his heavy black two-way radio, and pressed the emergency transmission button. He spoke directly to the club security dispatch, stating that a deranged homeless trespasser was actively harassing the staff and causing a severe disturbance on the 7th hole. Kendra stopped screaming, her mouth hanging open in complete disbelief. She stared at the heavy black radio in Brent's hand, entirely failing to comprehend that her own husband had just officially classified her as a homeless trespasser to save his garbage collection job. Less than a minute later, 2 customized golf carts sped across the manicured fairway carrying 4 heavily built, aggressive private security officers. They leaped from the carts and surrounded Kendra. They did not gently ask her to leave the premises. They followed standard protocol for dealing with hostile, unauthorized intruders disrupting the elite members. They grabbed her by the arms, attempting to physically escort her toward the perimeter fence. Kendra panicked and violently resisted, swinging her fists wildly and scratching one of the officers across the face. That single act of physical aggression sealed her fate. The officers immediately escalated their force. They brutally tackled her to the soft, pristine grass, completely pinning her to the ground. They twisted her arms sharply behind her back and snapped heavy steel handcuffs around her wrists. She wailed in pain and profound humiliation, her face pressed forcefully into the dirt. They hauled her roughly to her feet and literally dragged her off the golf course, completely ignoring her frantic, pathetic pleas for Brent to help her. Brent did not take a single step forward. He did not say a word in her defense. He simply stood there in his neon orange vest, gripping his metal trash grabber, and watched the security team throw his weeping wife into the back of a patrol vehicle. Once the flashing lights disappeared down the service road, Brent turned around, stabbed a discarded cigar butt with his metal tool, and dropped it into his plastic bag. The marriage was not just legally over, it was completely, violently, and irrevocably dead. The sterile fluorescent lighting of the county family courthouse offered absolutely no comfort. 1 month had passed since Kendra was dragged off the golf course in handcuffs. I sat quietly in the back row of the courtroom, watching the final pathetic remnants of their marriage play out before a completely exhausted judge. Brent and Kendra were seated at opposing tables, glaring at each other with pure, unadulterated hatred. Brent was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting suit he had likely purchased from a thrift shop, using the meager allowance I provided from his garnished wages. Kendra looked completely hollowed out, her hair tied back in a messy knot, wearing plain clothing provided by a local women's shelter. They had absolutely zero physical assets left to divide. They had no house, no luxury cars, and no bank accounts. Yet they were fighting like starved, rabid animals over a single, hypothetical prize. They were viciously arguing over who was legally entitled to half of my $4 million family trust upon my eventual death. Even after everything that had happened after the criminal indictments, the biohazard eviction, and the absolute destruction of their daily lives, their sheer parasitic greed remained entirely intact. Kendra's public defender argued that she was the sole blood heir and deserved the entirety of the future estate to rebuild her shattered life. Brent's court-appointed attorney aggressively countered, claiming that because Brent was still legally married to Kendra at the time, the trust was established, he was entitled to a 50% spousal share of her future inheritance. They were literally dividing my corpse while I was sitting right behind them in the gallery. Their blatant entitlement reached an entirely new level of absurdity when the judge asked how they intended to pay the mounting court costs and legal fees for this highly contested divorce. Neither of them had a single dollar to their name. Brent was living off grocery gift cards, and Kendra was entirely dependent on state welfare. Without missing a beat, both of their attorneys turned their attention directly to the back of the courtroom. They had officially subpoenaed me to appear at this hearing. Kendra stood up, pointing a shaking finger in my direction. She practically demanded that the judge order me to liquidate a portion of my family trust immediately to cover their legal expenses. She cried to the court that I was hoarding millions of dollars while my own daughter was forced to rely on public defenders. Brent chimed in, adopting a pathetic, victimized tone, claiming that my ruthless wage garnishment had completely impoverished him, leaving him unable to afford adequate legal representation. For a brief, sickening moment, the two of them united against a common enemy. They joined forces to try and bleed me dry one last time. The judge looked over his spectacles at me, clearly irritated by the chaotic circus unfolding in his courtroom. He asked me to approach the bench and explain why a wealthy patriarch was allowing his family to drain the state's limited legal resources. He suggested that it might be in everyone's best interest if I simply paid their legal fees to expedite the divorce proceedings and clear his docket. I stood up from the wooden bench, buttoned my tailored suit jacket, and walked calmly down the center aisle. I was not alone. Jonathan, my ruthless corporate attorney, walked right beside me, carrying a single slim leather folder. I stopped at the wooden gate separating the gallery from the legal tables. I looked directly at the judge and respectfully declined to pay a single cent toward their divorce. I stated that neither Brent nor Kendra had any legal standing whatsoever to claim financial hardship against my estate because neither of them possessed any future claim to my assets. The judge frowned, looking highly skeptical. He reminded me that under state inheritance laws, an only child is legally presumed to be the primary beneficiary of a family trust unless explicitly written out of a will. Kendra smirked from her table, visibly confident that the state law would protect her ultimate payday. She believed she simply had to outlive me to get her millions. Jonathan stepped forward and placed the slim leather folder onto the judge's elevated desk. He calmly explained that my late wife Cynthia was an incredibly brilliant, forward-thinking land developer who understood the dark complexities of human greed better than anyone. When she originally drafted the foundational documents for our family trust 30 years ago, she insisted on including a highly specific, unbreakable legal provision. Jonathan opened the folder and pointed to a highlighted paragraph on the original notarized trust agreement. It was known as the Violence Clause. Cynthia had explicitly stipulated that any beneficiary, heir, or spouse who committed an act of physical violence or severe emotional abuse against a core family member would trigger an automatic, immediate, and permanent disinheritance. The clause was ironclad, designed to protect the family legacy from being inherited by predators or abusers. Jonathan then handed the judge a secondary stack of documents. These were the certified hospital records from the emergency room, the official police report documenting the elder abuse investigation, and a fully authenticated transcript of the hidden dashcam audio where Kendra explicitly ordered Brent to throw the heavy oak chair at my face. Jonathan spoke clearly, ensuring his voice carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. He stated that the physical assault in my dining room was not just a criminal act. It was a legally binding trigger. The exact moment that wooden chair struck my face, drawing blood and causing severe blunt force trauma, the violence clause was permanently activated. The judge carefully read the original trust document, his eyes scanning Cynthia's precise legal language. He then read the emergency room medical report and the transcript of the dashcam confession. The heavy silence in the courtroom was absolute. Kendra's arrogant smirk completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer suffocating panic. She looked at the judge, then at her public defender, desperately waiting for someone to object. But there was absolutely no legal defense against her own recorded words and her husband's violent actions. The judge looked up from the documents, his expression hardening into a mask of pure judicial contempt. He looked directly at Kendra and Brent. He stated that the evidence was overwhelming and absolutely undeniable. He declared the violence clause fully executed and legally binding. The judge raised his heavy wooden gavel and brought it down hard against the sounding block. The loud, sharp crack echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. With that single strike of the gavel, Kendra was officially and permanently stripped of her inheritance. The decision to order her husband to throw a chair at my face over a petty argument about a bedroom had just cost her $4 million. She let out a hollow, agonizing gasp and collapsed into her chair, realizing she would never see a single penny of my money. But while Kendra was paralyzed by her massive financial loss, Brent underwent a terrifying psychological shift. He stared blankly at the floor. He had no wealthy wife to leech off in the future. He had no hidden offshore accounts to escape with. He was a legal slave working a humiliating minimum wage job, facing an imminent federal prison sentence with absolutely zero hope of a future payout. The final thread tethering him to sanity completely snapped. The avalanche had crushed everything in his life, leaving him as a cornered, desperate animal with absolutely nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is incredibly dangerous. Following the absolute humiliation in divorce court, Brent's mind finally shattered into a million irreparable pieces. He had no wealthy wife left to manipulate, no rich father-in-law to steal from, and absolutely no future left to salvage. He was a legal slave facing imminent federal prison time, completely trapped by his own actions. His narcissistic brain, incapable of accepting responsibility for his monumental failures, concluded there was only one ultimate solution remaining. He had to completely eliminate the architect of his destruction. He spent the last $40 of his weekly grocery allowance on a rusted, unregistered handgun from a desperate dealer operating out of a desolate motel parking lot. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he walked the dark city streets toward my luxury hotel. He slipped through the underground delivery entrance, avoiding the lobby security guards entirely, and took the service elevator up to the penthouse level. He stood outside the heavy wooden door of my suite, gripping the cold steel of the cheap weapon. His hands were shaking violently, but his eyes were completely devoid of any human empathy or hesitation. He raised his heavy steel-toed work boot, the exact same boot he was forced to wear to pick up garbage at the country club, and kicked the lock with every ounce of his remaining strength. The heavy door splintered instantly and flew open, crashing loudly against the interior wall. He stepped into the dark, silent suite, raising the weapon. The living room was completely dark, illuminated only by the faint amber glow of the city streetlights filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Brent moved with the frantic, jerky motions of a hunted animal with nothing left to lose. He kept the gun raised, sweeping the barrel across the empty leather sofa and the glass coffee table, fully expecting me to jump out from the shadows. He crept quietly down the short hallway toward the master bedroom. The bedroom door was pushed slightly ajar. He pushed it open with the barrel of the gun. In the center of the room, a large, human-sized lump rested quietly beneath the thick white hotel duvet. A soft, rhythmic breathing sound emanated from a small machine on the nightstand, perfectly simulating the deep sleep of an exhausted old man. Brent stood at the foot of the bed. He did not say a final word. He did not offer a villainous monologue to justify his actions. He simply aimed the rusted weapon directly at the center of the mass and pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of 3 consecutive gunshots shattered the absolute silence of the hotel suite. The bright muzzle flashes briefly illuminated his twisted, furious face. The heavy bullets tore right through the expensive duvet, burying themselves deeply into the mattress. Brent stood there for a long moment, his chest heaving heavily, a terrifying smile of pure victory finally spreading across his face. He truly believed he had finally won. He stepped forward and aggressively ripped the heavy white covers back to look at his handiwork. The smile instantly vanished from his lips. There was no blood. There was no body. He had just fired 3 rounds into a tightly rolled pile of extra hotel pillows and thick cotton blankets. A small portable white noise machine rested right next to the pillows, playing a recorded loop of heavy breathing. He stared blankly at the bullet holes in the feathers, his mind completely failing to process the massive deception. Before Brent could even lower the weapon, the heavy frosted glass door of the ensuite bathroom violently kicked open. He did not even have time to turn around. 6 heavily armored tactical officers from the city SWAT team swarmed into the bedroom, their tactical rifles raised and bright red laser sights painted directly onto Brent's chest. They screamed deafening commands, ordering him to drop the weapon immediately and get on the ground. Brent froze, entirely, completely paralyzed by the blinding tactical flashlights cutting through the darkness. The rusted gun slipped from his sweating fingers, hitting the carpet with a dull thud. 2 heavily armored officers lunged forward, tackling him brutally to the floor and driving their knees deep into his spine. They wrenched his arms roughly behind his back and secured him with heavy steel restraints. I was not hiding in the closet. I was not even in the same zip code. I was sitting comfortably in a completely different hotel suite across town, watching the entire tactical raid unfold in high definition through a covert security camera Jonathan had legally coordinated with the police department. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my chamomile tea as I watched the officers drag my former son-in-law out of the room. The trap had closed flawlessly. The district attorney did not even need to offer a plea deal. With the recovered weapon, the forced entry, and the physical bullet holes in the bed, Brent was indicted for first-degree attempted murder. Paired with his federal tax evasion charges and his active loan shark debts, the judge handed down a merciless, highly publicized sentence. Brent received 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of parole. He traded his tailored Italian suits for a bright orange jumpsuit completely stripped of his freedom, his arrogance, and his future. Kendra fared no better. Completely bankrupt, devoid of any family support and permanently blacklisted by her former wealthy social circle, she was forced to face the harsh reality of minimum wage survival. The woman who once demanded a $4 million estate was now working the graveyard shift at a desolate highway gas station. She spent her nights cleaning public restrooms and ringing up cheap cigarettes behind bulletproof glass, entirely erased from the privileged life she felt so entitled to. 6 months later, the biohazard remediation on my property was fully completed. The state health department officially cleared the structure, removing the red condemnation stickers from the front door. I returned to my quiet, pristine home. The walls were freshly painted, the floors were immaculately polished, and the air was completely pure. I walked slowly into the dining room, the exact place where this entire avalanche had begun. The heavy oak dining table was perfectly polished. Resting in the corner of the room was the shattered wooden chair Brent had thrown at my face. I had instructed the environmental crew to seal it in plastic and save it for me. I walked over and picked up the broken wooden leg that had struck my cheekbone. I held it up to the bright afternoon light streaming through the windows. The break was not jagged or splintered randomly from blunt force. About halfway through the thick oak cylinder there was a perfectly straight, incredibly smooth horizontal line. It had been neatly sawed halfway through with a high-precision blade, completely compromising its structural integrity. I am a master structural engineer. I know exactly how much pressure a support beam can take, and I know exactly how to make it fail catastrophically upon impact. I knew Brent possessed a violent, uncontrollable temper. I knew he would grab the heaviest object within reach when I pushed him to his breaking point by refusing to give up my bedroom. I engineered the chair to break precisely when it hit me, guaranteeing maximum visual damage and securing the undeniable legal evidence of a severe felony assault without risking a fatal skull fracture. I did not just survive their betrayal. I mathematically calculated their absolute destruction from day one. I placed the broken leg gently back onto the floor, turned off the dining room lights, and finally enjoyed the absolute beautiful silence of my home. The most profound lesson I learned is that true strength does not require shouting or physical retaliation. When toxic people mistake your silence for weakness, they inevitably build their own traps. As a structural engineer, I know that a rotten foundation will always collapse under its own weight if you simply let it bear the load of its own arrogance. Never allow anyone, even blood relatives, to dismantle your dignity or steal your peace. You owe absolutely nothing to those who actively abuse you. If my survival story resonated with you, please hit subscribe and comment your thoughts right below.